My brother spent 6 long years playing the grieving husband on national television. He squeezed out fake tears over his missing wife while our parents begged him to let her memory rest in peace. But just days after our parents' double funeral, I used a rusted key to unlock a condemned windowless garage they had left me in their will. Sitting on a torn couch inside the dark bunker staring straight back at me was his missing wife. She looked me dead in the eye and whispered that they had told everyone she was dead. Before I tell you how that rusted key exposed the most sickening crime in my family history, you need to understand how my own blood stripped me of my dignity, my career, and my future, all in a single afternoon. My name is Travis. I am 36 years old, and for my entire adult life, I was the invisible workhorse of my family. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my days buried in spreadsheets, untangling financial messes and making sure the numbers balance perfectly. My older brother Trent is exactly the opposite. Trent is 38 years old and built like a luxury billboard. He is a charismatic, aggressive real estate developer who wears custom-tailored suits and charms investors out of millions with a single smile. Our parents, who built a massive commercial real estate empire in Chicago, treated Trent like a king. They believed life was a game meant to be won by the loudest and the most ruthless player on the board. Trent was their golden child. I was just the calculator in the background. Whenever Trent made a reckless financial mistake, I was the one ordered to quietly fix it. I accepted the silence because I was conditioned to believe my role was the shield, while Trent was the sword. But a shield is only meant to take the damage. It is never meant to share in the glory. The reality of my standing in the family became brutally clear on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Our parents had passed away suddenly in a private helicopter crash a month prior. The shock had devastated the local business community, and the reading of their will was treated like a royal succession. We were gathered in the top-floor conference room of a high-end law firm in downtown Chicago. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooked the sprawling city skyline, a perfect view of the steel and glass towers our family owned. The room was packed with Trent's inner circle of country club elites, board members, and wealthy investors. My aunts and uncles were there, sipping sparkling water and whispering among themselves. Everyone knew Trent was going to take over the company, but tradition demanded a formal reading. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. My modest suit was completely out of place in a room filled with Rolex watches and diamond necklaces. Sitting next to me was my fiancée, Chloe. She sat with her back straight, her hand gripping mine tightly, expecting this to be the day I finally received my fair share of the family wealth. The head attorney, a stern man named Mr. Sterling, cleared his throat and opened a thick leather binder. The room went completely silent. Mr. Sterling began to read the legal jargon detailing the massive scope of the estate. He read my parents' final words praising Trent for his bold vision and unmatched leadership. Then came the distribution of assets. Mr. Sterling looked directly at Trent. He announced that to their eldest son, Trent, they left the entirety of the family commercial real estate portfolio. This included the corporate headquarters, 6 luxury shopping centers, 4 high-rise apartment buildings, and the majority voting shares of the company. The total valuation was estimated at roughly $40 million. The conference room erupted into polite applause. The board members nodded in deep approval. My aunts and uncles smiled brightly, raising their water glasses toward Trent in a silent toast. Trent leaned back in his leather chair, a smug, satisfied grin spreading across his face. He adjusted his silk tie and soaked in the admiration. He had won the empire. He had everything. Chloe squeezed my hand so hard her nails dug into my skin. She leaned in and whispered that my turn was next. She was breathing heavily, anticipating a massive cash payout or at least a secondary portfolio of properties to balance the scales. Mr. Sterling turned the page. He looked down at the document, then looked up at me. His expression was completely unreadable, but I saw a brief flicker of pity in his eyes. He reached into a drawer beneath the table and pulled out a standard manila envelope. It was thin-worn and completely unremarkable. He slid it across the long mahogany table. It stopped right in front of me. Mr. Sterling read the final clause. To our youngest son, Travis, we leave the deed to the industrial parcel located at the end of Blackwood Creek, along with the contents of the structure on the property. I stared at the envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the flap. I tipped it over, and a single heavy object dropped out onto the polished wood table. It was a rusted iron padlock key. Along with the key was a single sheet of paper. It was a property deed. I scanned the document, my heart sinking into my stomach with every word I read. The property was a single acre of land in a condemned toxic industrial zone 40 miles outside of the city. The area had been abandoned for decades due to severe soil contamination. The deed specifically mentioned a windowless concrete garage sitting in the middle of a swamp. It was a literal wasteland. Its market value was essentially zero. In fact, considering the property taxes and potential environmental cleanup fines, it was a financial liability. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Everyone stared at the rusted key lying on the table. It looked like a piece of garbage sitting on the expensive mahogany wood. Then Trent started to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and quickly grew into a booming, arrogant laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "Are you kidding me?" Trent choked out, wiping a tear of amusement from his eye. "They gave you the Blackwood Swamp. I remember Dad talking about that useless patch of dirt years ago. He bought it by accident in a bundle deal and could not even give it away to the city for free." I sat frozen. The heat of humiliation burned my neck and face. I looked around the room, hoping anyone would defend me or question the sanity of this decision. Instead, the country club elites began to snicker. My aunts and uncles exchanged amused glances, shaking their heads as if my parents had pulled off a brilliant practical joke from beyond the grave. Trent stood up, walking slowly around the table until he was standing right behind my chair. He placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "Honestly, Travis, it makes perfect sense," Trent said loudly, ensuring every person in the room could hear him clearly. "You have always liked hiding in the background, crunching numbers in the dark. Now you finally have a proper dirt-level office for your little accounting career. You can sit in your swamp garage and count the mosquitoes. Just make sure you do not track any toxic mud into my corporate lobby when you come begging for a job next week." The entire room erupted into laughter. The sound of their amusement hit me like physical blows. They were mocking my entire existence. My parents had not just given me nothing. They had gone out of their way to humiliate me in front of the people who mattered most to Trent. They had handed him a crown and handed me a rusted piece of scrap metal. I did not yell. I did not flip the table. I simply picked up the rusted key, folded the worthless deed, and put them in my pocket. I stood up, keeping my face perfectly blank, and walked out of the conference room. I could hear Trent making another joke about me as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind me. I walked into the lavish, marble-floored lobby of the law firm and pressed the button for the elevator. My chest felt tight. I could hardly draw a breath. I tried to process the sheer magnitude of the rejection. The sound of sharp heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor broke my thoughts. I turned to see Chloe marching toward me. Her face was flushed with absolute rage. Her eyes, which usually looked at me with warmth, were now filled with pure disgust. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the empty lobby. "You are just going to walk away. Are you out of your mind?" I looked at her, exhausted to my bones. "What do you want me to do, Chloe? The will is ironclad. Sterling is the best estate lawyer in the state. They made their choice. You fight it!" She practically screamed, stepping right into my personal space. "You hire a lawyer and you sue your brother for your half of the 40 million. You do not just take a rusted key and walk out like a whipped dog." I shook my head slowly. I cannot afford a legal battle against Trent. He has the entire corporate legal team at his disposal. He has unlimited funds now. If I sue him, he will drag it out in court for a decade until I am bankrupt. I know how he operates because I am the one who always managed the legal budgets. The money is gone. Chloe stared at me as if she was looking at a disgusting insect. I could see the exact moment the love drained out of her entirely. It was replaced by a cold, hard calculation. She had not been in love with me. She had been in love with the proximity to the family fortune. She had tolerated my quiet nature because she assumed it would eventually pay off. Now that the payoff was a toxic swamp, her investment in me was completely void. "You are exactly what your brother says you are," she said, her voice dropping to a vicious quiet whisper. "You are a spineless loser. You have no ambition. You have no backbone. I have spent a year of my life pretending you were going to step up and be a real man. I thought you were just biding your time, but you are just weak." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, worse than the laughter in the conference room. "Chloe, please," I said, keeping my voice low. "We can build our own life. I am a highly skilled accountant. I have my own firm. We do not need their money to be successful. We can start over." She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Do you honestly think I want to be married to a small-time accountant fighting for scraps? Do you think I want to live in a modest suburban house while your brother buys penthouses and yachts? I wanted the Empire Travis. If you are too much of a coward to take it, then I am done wasting my time." Without another word, she grabbed her left hand and yanked the engagement ring off her finger. It was a diamond ring I had spent my entire life savings to buy. I had worked nights and weekends for 2 years to afford it, wanting to give her something that felt worthy of the lifestyle she desired. She threw the ring directly at my chest. It bounced off my jacket and hit the marble floor with a sharp, high-pitched ping. The ring rolled across the glossy tiles and stopped near the brass elevator doors. "Have a nice life in your swamp," she sneered. Then she turned around and walked out through the revolving glass doors, leaving me completely alone. I slowly walked over and knelt on the hard marble. I picked up the ring. It felt incredibly heavy in my palm. Beside the ring in my pocket was the rusted key and the deed to the toxic swamp. In a matter of 30 minutes, I had lost my family, my inheritance, my dignity, and my future wife. I had been stripped down to absolute zero. I realized then that the system my family had built was designed to keep me at the bottom. Trent had taken the empire. Chloe had taken my heart. My parents had taken my years. The brass doors slid open, revealing an empty, mirrored cab. I stepped inside and looked at my reflection. I looked broken, but I reached into my pocket and pulled out the rusted key. Why would my parents go out of their way to explicitly leave me a condemned patch of land and this specific key? They wanted me to go to that swamp. I gripped the key tightly in my fist. I had no idea that this rusted piece of metal was about to expose a crime so sickening it would make national headlines. The conflict was no longer about money. It was about survival. The morning after the will reading, I did what I always did when my life felt chaotic. I went to work. Numbers have rules. Spreadsheets do not change based on human cruelty. I needed the cold, rigid structure of my desk at the accounting firm to ground me. I parked in the underground garage of the downtown high-rise and walked to the elevator banks. My suit was slightly wrinkled from sleeping on my sofa after Chloe threw the ring at me, but I figured a fresh cup of coffee and a complex audit would straighten my mind. I reached the security turnstiles on the 40th floor and swiped my employee badge. A sharp red light blinked. The screen displayed access denied. I tried again. Denied. A security guard in a dark blue uniform stepped out from behind the reception desk. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He asked me to step aside and told me the managing partner was waiting for me in the lobby conference room. I knew right then that the nightmare had followed me out of the law office. I walked into the glass-walled room and found Harrison standing by the window. Harrison had been my mentor for 7 years. He was the man who taught me how to trace hidden offshore accounts and unravel corporate fraud. He did not look me in the eye when I walked in. On the table between us sat a standard cardboard box containing my favorite coffee mug, my framed degree, and a few pens. Harrison cleared his throat and said he had received a phone call at 6 in the morning. Trent had called him directly from his personal cell phone. My brother did not mince words. He informed Harrison that as the new sole owner of the family real estate empire, he was currently reviewing all vendor contracts. Trent told him that any firm employing a man as unstable and untrustworthy as his younger brother would immediately lose the family portfolio. That portfolio represented 40% of our billable hours. It kept the lights on and paid the bonuses for everyone in the building. I stood there staring at the cardboard box. I asked Harrison if my flawless track record meant anything. I reminded him that I had saved the firm millions last quarter by catching a tax discrepancy. Harrison finally looked at me and his face was drawn with guilt. He said he was truly sorry, but business was business. He could not risk the jobs of 200 employees just to protect one forensic accountant. He handed me a severance check and told me I had to leave the premises immediately. I picked up the box. The weight of it felt pathetic. As I rode the elevator down to the street level, the reality began to sink in. Trent was not satisfied with taking my inheritance. He wanted to erase my ability to survive. I drove back to my rented condo in Lincoln Park. The sky had turned a bruising gray, and a heavy autumn rain was beginning to wash over the city. I needed to regroup. I needed a shower and a quiet place to figure out my next move. I carried my cardboard box up the stairs to the 3rd floor. When I reached my door, I stopped dead in my tracks. A bright orange piece of paper was taped directly over the peephole. It was a formal notice to vacate the premises immediately. I ripped the paper off the door and read the fine print. The property management company had changed hands exactly 31 days ago. The new owner was listed as a shell corporation based out of Delaware. My mind raced through the corporate structures I had studied for years. I pulled out my phone and accessed a public records database. It took me less than 2 minutes to trace the registered agent of the shell corporation right back to Trent's primary holding company. My brother had bought the building I lived in a month before our parents even died. He had been planning this. The notice cited a structural emergency renovation clause. It stated that due to critical plumbing failures in the central line, my lease was legally terminated for safety reasons, effective immediately. It was a vicious legal loophole. By claiming the building was a hazard, he bypassed the standard 90-day eviction process. Just as I finished reading the notice, the door down the hall opened. The building manager walked out, accompanied by a locksmith carrying a heavy tool bag. The manager wore a bored expression and held a clipboard. He told me I had exactly 1 hour to gather my essential belongings before the locks were changed and the unit was sealed for construction. I tried to explain that there was no plumbing issue, that this was a targeted harassment campaign by the owner. The manager just tapped his pen against the clipboard. He said he did not care about my family drama, and if I was not out in 60 minutes, he would call the police and have me arrested for trespassing. I unlocked my door and walked into my home. The air felt suffocating. I grabbed 2 large duffel bags from my closet and began frantically shoving clothes into them. I packed my laptop, my forensic accounting software hard drives, and whatever loose cash I could find in my desk drawer. I had to leave behind my furniture, my books, and every small comfort I had built over the past decade. The physical toll of stripping my life down to 2 canvas bags made my hands shake violently. I dragged the bags out into the hallway just as the locksmith began drilling out the deadbolt. I walked away, listening to the sound of metal grinding against metal, locking me out of my own life forever. I loaded the duffel bags into the trunk of my car as the rain began to fall in sheets. The cold water soaked through my suit jacket. I sat in the driver's seat and turned the heater on full blast. I took a deep breath and tried to approach the situation clinically. I was a forensic accountant. I knew how to survive a financial crisis. I had a solid emergency fund in my personal checking account. It was enough to rent a nice extended stay hotel for a few months while I secured a new job at a rival firm. I pulled out my phone and opened my mobile banking application to transfer funds. The screen loaded slowly. When the numbers finally appeared, my stomach completely dropped. Available balance $0. A red banner across the top of the screen read, Account frozen pending legal review. Panic flared in my chest. I dialed the customer service number on the back of my debit card. After navigating a maze of automated menus, I finally reached a fraud prevention specialist. I demanded to know why my money was inaccessible. The representative spoke in a calm, detached voice. She informed me that an ex parte injunction had been filed in state court that very morning. The executors of my parents' estate, representing my brother Trent, had placed a hard freeze on all my personal assets. The legal filing claimed there was probable cause to believe I had embezzled funds from the family trust over the last 5 years. They alleged that the money in my personal accounts was stolen property. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. It was a complete fabrication. I had never touched a single cent of their money. But in the eyes of the banking system, an emergency court order from a high-powered law firm was absolute law. The freeze was temporary, but it would take weeks of expensive litigation to prove my innocence and get the hold lifted. Trent knew I could not fight him without money, and he had just ensured I could not pay a lawyer to unfreeze the funds. It was a perfectly executed financial assassination. I checked my wallet. I had exactly $42 and some spare change. I sat in the idling car while the torrential storm battered the windshield. The city of Chicago felt like a massive concrete cage closing in around me. Trent had systematically cut every single cord tethering me to society. He took my career. He took my home. He took my life savings. He wanted me to crawl back to him begging for a handout so he could humiliate me one final time. He wanted to prove that without the family I was nothing more than a pathetic loser. The rain poured down the glass, blurring the streetlights into streaks of yellow and red. I looked at the dashboard clock. It was 4 in the afternoon, but the storm made it look like midnight. I had nowhere to go. I could not check into a hotel. I could not buy a plane ticket. I had enough gas in the tank to drive for maybe 3 hours. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. The sheer exhaustion of the last 24 hours pressed down on my shoulders like physical lead. I reached into the inner pocket of my damp suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the rough edge of the rusted iron key and the folded property deed. It was the only thing I owned that Trent had not taken. He had laughed at it. The lawyers had dismissed it, but my parents had deliberately placed it in my hands. The forensic accountant inside my brain began to analyze the variables. Trent had bought my apartment building a month ago. He had planned my ruin, but he did not know about the key. The will had been sealed. If Trent knew that patch of land had any value, he would have stripped it from the estate before the ink was dry. Why did my parents leave me a condemned patch of land in an industrial wasteland? Why go through the trouble of drafting a legal deed for a property they supposedly hated? The math did not add up. The narrative Trent was pushing was too clean, and my parents never did anything without a calculated reason. There was an anomaly sitting at the end of Blackwood Creek. I opened my eyes. The desperation in my chest hardened into something sharp and cold. I put the car in gear. I navigated through the flooded city streets, merging onto the highway headed away from the glittering skyline. The drive took over 2 hours, fighting through the blinding rain and heavy traffic. As I left the city limits, the roads grew darker and more desolate. I turned off the main highway onto a crumbling 2-lane road that wound through thick, overgrown forests and abandoned manufacturing lots. The streetlights vanished entirely. The only illumination came from my headlights cutting through the heavy downpour. I drove until the pavement gave way to deeply rutted gravel and mud. At the very end of a dead-end path, my headlights swept over a chain-link fence covered in warning signs. I threw the car into park and stared through the rain at the property. I had reached the end of the line. I grasped the rusted key in my right hand, stepping out into the storm to face whatever my parents had left behind. The cold rain soaked me instantly as I approached the heavy iron gates. Beyond the fence, the overgrown swamp grass thrashed violently in the wind. Standing dead center in the middle of the desolation was a massive, windowless concrete structure. It looked like an abandoned military bunker sinking into the mud. Trent had called this my dirt-level office. He thought he had buried me here. I looked down at the key in my hand, feeling the heavy, jagged iron digging into my skin. I did not know what was waiting for me inside that concrete tomb, but I knew one thing for certain. My brother had taken everything from me, and whatever was hiding behind those doors was going to be my only way to survive the night. I pushed open the rusted gate and walked into the dark. The storm battered the roof of my car with such violence it sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the metal. I sat in the idling vehicle, staring through the rain-slicked windshield at the chain-link fence. Beyond the rusted wire sat the single acre of land my parents had left me. Blackwood Creek was not just isolated. It was a geographic ghost town. Decades ago, the county had zoned this entire district for heavy chemical manufacturing. When the factories inevitably went bankrupt, they left behind poisoned soil and contaminated groundwater. The city had condemned the surrounding miles, abandoning the roads to weeds and feral wildlife. According to the property deed sitting on my passenger seat, the plot of land was worth absolutely nothing. Trent and his team of high-priced attorneys had legally classified it as a toxic liability. But as I sat there shivering in my damp suit, the forensic accountant inside me began to wake up. My entire career was built on finding the hidden truth inside numbers. I was trained to look for anomalies to spot the exact moment a ledger stopped making sense. I wiped a layer of condensation off the inside of the glass and leaned forward, squinting into the dark. The structure sitting in the middle of the overgrown lot was a brutalist concrete garage. It had no windows and a flat, heavy roof, but that was not what caught my attention. Running down the side of a massive wooden utility pole near the property line was a thick cluster of industrial conduit cables. They were completely out of place. Those cables plunged directly into the muddy earth, routing massive amounts of electricity underground toward the garage. I looked higher up the pole and spotted a commercial Grade 3 phase power transformer. My mind immediately began running the calculations. Installing a 3-phase transformer and routing heavy-duty insulated lines underground in a condemned zone would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in permits, equipment, and specialized labor. A standard storage garage did not require a commercial power grid. An empty concrete box in a swamp did not draw enough voltage to justify that kind of infrastructure. The narrative Trent had fed the room full of country club elites was that my parents had bought this land by accident and left it to me as a cruel joke. But numbers never lie, and the numbers I was looking at told a completely different story. Someone had spent a fortune keeping this facility completely off the books. I turned off the ignition and stepped out into the freezing rain. The mud instantly ruined my leather dress shoes, sinking past my ankles as I forced my way toward the rusted iron gates. I pushed the chain-link doors open and waded through the tall, dead grass. The wind howled through the barren trees surrounding the lot, masking the sound of my footsteps. As I approached the front of the concrete structure, the details became even more suspicious. The exterior walls were stained with algae and cracked with age, acting as a perfect camouflage. But the heavy steel security door set into the concrete was immaculate. It was painted a dull matte gray to blend in, but the hinges were freshly oiled and the reinforced steel frame was built to withstand a military-grade assault. A massive iron padlock hung from the door latch. The outside of the lock was covered in a convincing layer of surface rust. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy iron key my parents had left me. My fingers were numb from the freezing rain, making it difficult to grip the metal. I slid the key into the base of the padlock. It did not catch on rust or debris. It glided in perfectly smooth. The internal tumblers were pristine. I turned the key and the heavy lock disengaged with a solid, satisfying click. I pulled the padlock free and grabbed the steel handle of the door. I braced my boots in the mud and pulled backward with all my strength. The heavy door swung open, revealing absolute pitch-black darkness inside. I stepped over the threshold and pulled the door shut behind me, instantly cutting off the sound of the howling storm. I stood in the suffocating darkness for a moment, listening to my own ragged breathing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone using the flashlight application to sweep a beam of harsh white light across the room. I expected to see rusting tools, rotting wood, or the decaying remains of forgotten storage. Instead, the beam of light reflected off pristine white walls. The interior of the garage was entirely empty. There were no cars. There was no trash. The concrete floor was swept completely clean. It was a sterile vestibule. At the far end of the empty room was a set of brushed steel elevator doors built flush into the concrete wall. Beside the doors was a simple metallic call button. My heart hammered against my ribs. Elevators did not belong in abandoned garages. The infrastructure required to sink an elevator shaft into marshy, contaminated soil was staggering. It required massive excavation, reinforced concrete pilings, and a completely waterproof subterranean shell. The millions of dollars required for a project like this would have to be hidden behind layers of shell companies and fake vendor invoices just to keep it off the official family balance sheets. My parents had systematically drained cash from their own real estate empire to build something massive under the earth. I walked slowly across the empty floor. I pressed the call button. Deep beneath my feet, I felt a low, powerful vibration. The hum of heavy industrial machinery echoed up the shaft. A moment later, the steel doors slid open with a quiet, pneumatic hiss. The interior of the elevator was brightly lit with recessed overhead panels. I stepped inside. There was no standard panel of floor numbers. There was only a single heavy toggle switch pointing downward. I flipped the switch. The doors closed, sealing me inside a polished steel box. The elevator began to descend. It did not drop a mere 10 or 20 feet like a standard basement. The descent was smooth but relentless. I counted the seconds, trying to calculate the depth based on the speed of the drop. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The air pressure in the small cabin shifted, making my ears pop. I was traveling at least 6 or 7 stories beneath the surface of the swamp. Whoever built this had designed it to survive a catastrophic event, or to ensure that whatever was buried down here would never be discovered by the outside world. The elevator slowed to a halt. The quiet hum of the machinery faded. The steel doors slid open. I braced myself, expecting to walk into a damp, dark cavern or a vault filled with illicit cash and stolen gold. What I saw instead paralyzed me completely. I stepped out of the elevator into a sprawling, brilliantly lit living space. The air was perfectly climate-controlled, carrying the faint, crisp scent of ozone from high-end commercial air purifiers. The floors were lined with rich, dark faux hardwood. The walls were painted a warm, comforting beige and decorated with tasteful framed landscape prints. To my left was a fully equipped modern kitchen featuring stainless steel appliances and a massive double-door refrigerator. To my right was an expansive library area with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves packed with hundreds of thick hardcover volumes. It was not a dungeon. It was a retrofitted luxury fallout shelter designed to mimic the interior of a high-end suburban home. But the illusion of comfort could not hide the terrifying reality of the architecture. There were no windows. The ceilings were low and made of reinforced concrete. The soft ambient lighting was designed to simulate daylight, but it felt artificial and trapping. It was a gilded cage buried 60 feet under the earth. I walked slowly forward, my wet shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. My mind struggled to process the sheer scale of the deception. Why would my parents build a multi-million-dollar underground mansion? Who was it meant for? I moved past the kitchen area, scanning the countertops. There were fresh dishes in the drying rack. A half-empty glass of water sat on the granite island. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. The bunker was not abandoned. Someone was living down here right now. I froze, listening intently. Above the quiet whisper of the ventilation system, I heard the faint sound of a television playing. I followed the noise, walking cautiously down a short hallway that opened up into a spacious living room. A large flat-screen television was mounted on the wall, playing an old classic movie on a muted volume. Sitting on a plush leather sofa facing the screen was a woman. She was wrapped in a thick cashmere cardigan, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her back was to me. She was staring blankly at the television, seemingly lost in a deep, dissociative trance. I took a step backward, wanting to retreat to the elevator, but my wet shoe slipped heavily against the hardwood floor, creating a loud, sharp squeak. The woman stiffened. She did not scream. She did not jump up in panic. Instead, she turned her head slowly as if she was used to the sounds of the bunker, but deeply afraid of whoever was standing behind her. She stood up and turned around to face me. The breath completely left my lungs. I dropped my phone. It hit the floor with a loud crack, but I did not even look down. I could not tear my eyes away from her face. She looked remarkably pale, her skin lacking the vital glow of natural sunlight, but she was meticulously well kept. Her long blonde hair was pulled back into a neat braid. Her facial structure was sharper and more hollowed out than I remembered, but there was absolutely no mistaking who she was. Her face had been plastered across every major news network, every true crime documentary, and every front-page magazine in the country for the better part of a decade. It was Clara, Trent's wife. 6 years ago, Clara had vanished without a single trace. Her disappearance had triggered one of the largest multi-state manhunts in modern American history. The narrative Trent had fed to the police, the media, and the public was a masterpiece of tragic theater. He claimed she had gone for an evening jog near the lakefront and never returned. For months, Trent was on primetime television every single night. I remembered watching him sit on velvet talk show couches, weeping uncontrollably, dabbing at his eyes with expensive handkerchiefs. He begged the public for any information regarding his beautiful, beloved wife. He offered $1 million reward for her safe return. Our parents had stood right behind him, holding his shoulders, playing the role of the devastated grieving in-laws to absolute perfection. The police eventually found Clara's blood matching her DNA inside an abandoned stolen vehicle miles away from the city. The official ruling was a fatal hit and run. Her body was never recovered, but a judge eventually allowed Trent to hold a massive, highly publicized memorial service. He played the shattered widower so well that investors threw money at his real estate projects just to show him sympathy and support. Clara became a tragic legend, and Trent became a martyr. But Clara was not dead. She was standing 10 feet away from me, breathing and watching me with wide, terrified eyes. My mind shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The calculations, the logic, the rigid numbers that ruled my entire life completely dissolved. My family had not just stolen my inheritance. My brother and my parents had orchestrated a horrifying long-term kidnapping. They had locked a human being in a concrete box buried beneath a toxic swamp and played the victims for the entire world to see. Clara took a small, trembling step backward, pulling the cashmere cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She looked at my soaked suit and the shock written across my face. She clearly recognized me. She had sat at my Thanksgiving dinner tables. She had attended my accounting firm holiday parties on Trent's arm. She knew exactly who I was. "Travis," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly raspy and fragile, like a muscle that had not been used in years. I tried to speak, but my throat was completely paralyzed. I just stared at her, trying to reconcile the ghost from the television screens with the living, breathing woman standing in the subterranean living room. Clara looked past me, staring at the open hallway leading back to the elevator. She looked for Trent. When she realized I was completely alone, her eyes filled with a desperate, agonizing mixture of hope and profound sorrow. She took another step forward, the ambient bunker light casting dark shadows under her hollow eyes. "They told everyone I was dead," she whispered. Her voice broke on the final word, echoing off the concrete ceiling. "Did they really tell everyone I was dead?" The air in the subterranean room felt completely still. For a long time, neither of us moved. My mind raced through 1,000 impossible scenarios, trying to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. I am a man of logic and strict numbers. When a financial column does not balance, I trace the ledger back to the original source until the truth reveals itself. But there was no logical ledger for the woman standing in front of me. Clara had been officially dead for years. I had attended her lavish memorial service. I had watched my brother weep over an empty mahogany casket on national television. Yet here she was, breathing and shivering in a concrete box 60 feet beneath a toxic swamp. She asked me again if they had really told everyone she was dead. Her voice trembled, carrying the raw, fragile weight of a person who had not spoken to another human being in an absolute eternity. I forced myself to nod. I told her that there were national news broadcasts and massive candlelight vigils. I told her that Trent had spent years playing the heartbroken widower on television, using her memory to build a massive charity profile. As the horrifying words left my mouth, Clara collapsed back onto the leather sofa. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest and began to sob. It was not a loud, theatrical cry. It was a silent, suffocating weep of pure agony. The sheer cruelty of what she had endured radiated through the room. I walked over and sat carefully on the edge of the coffee table, facing her. I needed to know how a beloved heiress ended up buried alive by her own husband. I asked her exactly what happened 6 years ago. Clara wiped her pale face with the sleeve of her cashmere sweater. She took a slow, shuddering breath and began to systematically dismantle the flawless illusion of my family. She told me that 6 years ago Trent was not the invincible real estate mogul everyone believed him to be. His glorious empire was actually bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate. He had over-leveraged himself on a series of disastrous commercial development projects in downtown Chicago. He was drowning in toxic debt, and the major corporate banks were quietly preparing to call in his massive loans. The entire family business was merely weeks away from total catastrophic bankruptcy. I listened with growing horror. As the family forensic accountant, I was never given access to Trent's private corporate ledgers. My parents had intentionally kept me entirely in the dark, handling my brother's catastrophic financial failures internally. Clara explained that she was his only remaining lifeline. Before they even met, Clara had inherited a $50 million blind trust from her late grandfather, who was a famously wealthy industrialist. Her grandfather had despised Trent from the very beginning. He thought my brother was a charming but deeply empty shell of a man. Because of that extreme distrust, her grandfather structured the trust fund so that Trent had absolutely no legal authority over the money. Clara was the sole beneficiary, and the funds were locked down by strict legal parameters designed to prevent a spouse from draining the accounts. When Trent's real estate company started to collapse, he frantically demanded that Clara liquidate her massive trust to bail him out. He pleaded and manipulated, claiming the grand family legacy was at stake. But Clara had refused completely. She looked me straight in the eyes and told me exactly why she said no. A week before, Trent begged for the $50 million. Clara had discovered he was having a severe long-term affair. She had found a hidden prepaid phone buried at the bottom of his gym bag. The text messages proved that Trent was not only cheating on her, but he was actively meeting with aggressive asset protection attorneys. He was trying to figure out a dirty legal loophole to seize a massive chunk of her trust fund in an impending divorce settlement. He never truly loved her. He only loved the immense financial safety net she provided to his fragile ego. Clara confronted him that same night. She told him the marriage was completely over and that she was packing her bags to leave him forever. She promised him, looking right into his eyes, that he would not get a single dime of her grandfather's money. She was going to let him go bankrupt and face the humiliating public ruin he completely deserved. That was the exact moment Trent realized his entire world was going to burn to the ground. He could not afford a divorce. He could not afford to lose access to her $50 million. He definitely could not afford the devastating public scandal. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly on the sofa as the traumatic memories forcefully surfaced. She described the night she was supposed to leave. She had packed her suitcases and was waiting in the modern kitchen of their lakefront estate for a private car to take her to the airport. Our parents had come over unannounced under the guise of mediating the bitter domestic dispute. They sat at the kitchen island pouring expensive wine and begging her to reconsider destroying the family reputation. Clara took a single sip of the red wine my mother poured for her. That was her last normal memory of the outside world. The wine had been heavily laced with powerful prescription sedatives. When she woke up, she was lying on the very sofa she was sitting on right now. The heavy steel door to the elevator was locked tight. Trent and my father were standing over her, holding a thick stack of legal documents and a digital tablet. They did not just kidnap her in a panic. They had orchestrated a terrifying masterpiece of psychological warfare. Trent pressed play on a local news broadcast recorded earlier that morning. The news anchor reported a horrific fatal hit and run accident on a dark county road just outside the city limits. A local pedestrian had been struck and killed by a speeding luxury SUV. The heavily damaged vehicle had been found abandoned in a muddy ditch a few miles away. Trent calmly paused the video and looked down at Clara. He told her that the abandoned SUV was registered directly in her name. He coldly explained that while she was unconscious, they had extracted her blood with a medical syringe and smeared it all over the deployed airbags and the steering column. They had purposely planted her blonde hair on the shattered windshield glass. They created a flawless forensic crime scene implicating her in a fatal felony. The trap was absolute perfection. Trent smiled a sickening smile and explained the terms of her new existence. If Clara ever managed to escape this underground bunker and go to the local authorities, she would be immediately arrested for vehicular manslaughter. He promised her that his high-priced defense attorneys would make sure she was convicted and sent to a maximum security federal prison for the rest of her natural life. Our parents had stood right beside him, nodding in full silent agreement. They chose to literally bury their daughter-in-law alive rather than watch their golden son face a financial collapse. They prioritized their precious commercial real estate empire over a human life. Clara spent the first 2 years screaming at the steel elevator doors. She tried to pry the reinforced metal apart until her fingers bled and her nails cracked. She desperately hoped someone would realize the hit and run was an elaborate setup. But the crushing isolation eventually broke her down. Trent would visit the bunker once a week, bringing fresh groceries, clean clothes, and basic survival supplies. During those visits, he would casually sit in the armchair and tell her how much the public pitied him. He brought down newspaper clippings of the massive police manhunt. He brought down glossy magazines showing his tearful emotional interviews. He wanted her to fully understand that the entire world had bought his tragic story completely. He wanted to crush any lingering hope that someone out there might be looking for her. The psychological torture was carefully designed to make her docile and compliant. He built this luxurious underground prison to keep her physically healthy but mentally shattered. I sat on the coffee table feeling a wave of intense physical nausea wash over me. The sheer scale of the sociopathic behavior was difficult to process, even for an analytical mind. I am a forensic accountant. I track missing money through complex webs of corporate shell companies. I know exactly how greedy, desperate people operate behind closed doors. But this was an entirely different level of pure evil. I asked Clara why Trent did not simply kill her that night in the kitchen. If he was willing to frame her for murder and lock her in a concrete vault, why go through the massive expense and risk of keeping her alive? Clara looked down at her pale, trembling hands. Because of the blind trust, she explained softly. Her grandfather's legal stipulations were incredibly rigid and unforgiving. If Clara died under mysterious, violent, or sudden circumstances, the entire $50 million would immediately be dispersed to a series of specific charitable organizations. Trent would not get a single penny. The only way Trent could legally inherit her fortune was if she simply fainted into thin air and stayed missing for a very long time. The pieces of the massive puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. I knew the specific probate laws in our state perfectly. If a person disappears and their absence is continuous and unexplained for a period of exactly 5 to 7 years, a legal spouse can petition the court to have them formally declared dead in absentia. Trent could not murder her because a physical body would trigger a medical autopsy and an automatic transfer of the trust to the charities. He had to fake her disappearance, build a massive public narrative of tragedy, and then simply wait out the grueling legal clock. I asked her how long it had been since Trent last visited the underground bunker. Clara thought for a moment, her brow furrowing. She said he had come down exactly 3 weeks ago. He had brought an expensive bottle of imported champagne. He popped the cork, poured himself a crystal glass, and smiled at her with genuine triumph. He told her the mandated waiting period was officially over. A state judge had signed the final probate paperwork, formally declaring her legally dead. He had successfully absorbed the entire $50 million trust fund into his personal accounts. He told her she was no longer financially necessary, but he was going to keep her down here anyway, just in case the police ever decided to reopen the cold case file. He arrogantly promised he would come back the following month with more supplies. 3 weeks ago. The timing was entirely too precise to be a coincidence. That was the exact week my parents died in the sudden helicopter crash. My mind worked furiously, connecting the dark dots of the grand timeline. My parents had helped Trent orchestrate this massive crime 6 years ago just to save the family empire from public humiliation. They had secretly funded the construction of this underground bunker, masking the exorbitant costs through their various commercial development companies. They had lived with the agonizing secret every single day. But as the years dragged on, the sheer guilt must have started eating them alive from the inside out. When Trent finally secured the $50 million from the court ruling, the financial crisis was officially solved permanently. The empire was safe and secure, but Clara was still trapped in a concrete box, breathing recycled air. I realized then that my parents were absolute monsters, but they were monsters who eventually cracked under the crushing weight of their own terrifying sins. They could not bring themselves to confess to the police because it would mean destroying Trent and exposing themselves to decades in a federal prison. But they could not simply ignore Clara rotting away in the dark forever. They needed a silent contingency plan. They needed someone who could quietly uncover the truth without drawing immediate public suspicion. They needed their invisible, completely overlooked son. That was exactly why they explicitly wrote the condemned swamp into their final will. That was why they placed the rusted iron key in that thin manila envelope and directed their high-powered attorney to hand it to me during the formal reading. It was not a practical joke. It was not a final act of familial humiliation to make the country club elites laugh. It was a desperate, posthumous confession. They knew I was a meticulous forensic accountant who could not leave a mystery unsolved. They knew I would not just throw the worthless deed away. They knew I would eventually drive out to the wasteland, investigate the weird electrical property lines, and use the key to unlock the heavy steel door. They shifted the ultimate burden of their horrific crime directly onto my shoulders. I stood up from the coffee table. The air in the bunker suddenly felt incredibly thin and charged with static electricity. Trent had everything he ever wanted in the world. He had my parents' $40 million real estate empire. He had Clara's $50 million trust fund. He had the unwavering public sympathy of an entire nation. He had even managed to systematically destroy my career, my home, and my engagement in a matter of hours just to ensure I was completely powerless to fight back. He thought he had buried me entirely. He thought I was just a spineless loser sitting in a toxic swamp crying over my frozen bank accounts. He had absolutely no idea that my parents had given me the one thing capable of destroying his entire universe. I looked down at Clara. The frightened, fragile woman sitting on the leather sofa was not just a kidnapped wife waiting to be rescued. She was a living, breathing nuclear bomb aimed directly at Trent's carefully constructed empire. I walked over to the sofa and reached out my hand. I told her we were leaving right now. I told her I did not care about the sophisticated blackmail or the fabricated hit-and-run evidence. I am an accountant, I explained, keeping my voice steady and fiercely resolute. I know exactly how to prove massive corporate fraud. If Trent manufactured a fake crime scene, he paid someone off to do it. He bought the wrecked car. He bought the blood supply. He paid heavily for absolute silence. And in my professional experience, silence is the most expensive commodity on the market. There is a deeply buried paper trail, and I am going to find it. Clara looked at my outstretched hand. For the first time in 6 excruciating years, a genuine spark of fierce life appeared in her hollow eyes. She slowly reached out and grasped my palm. Her fingers were freezing cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. We walked toward the open steel elevator doors, leaving the muted television playing to an empty room. My arrogant brother thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess while I was just a disposable pawn on his board. He did not realize I had just acquired the queen. The bitter battle for mere survival was officially over. The hunt for justice had begun. The heavy silence of the underground living room was suddenly shattered by a deep mechanical grinding noise echoing from the concrete ceiling. The ambient lighting flickered for a fraction of a second. A low, rhythmic vibration began to hum through the floorboards. The elevator machinery had engaged. Someone was coming down. Clara let out a sharp gasp. The tiny spark of fierce life that had just appeared in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by absolute sheer terror. She scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the beige wall. She wrapped her arms around her head, pulling her knees to her chest. She began hyperventilating, whispering over and over that he was back and that he was going to kill them both. I stood completely still in the center of the room. My mind shifted into the cold, clinical gear I used when auditing fraudulent corporate ledgers. I analyzed the exact variables of our situation. Trent had officially secured the $50 million trust fund 3 weeks ago. The financial crisis was permanently solved. He had absolutely zero reason to travel 40 miles into an abandoned toxic swamp during a torrential midnight storm just to visit a prisoner he no longer needed. The arrival of the elevator was not a scheduled supply run. It was an emergency response. I thought back to the rusted iron padlock on the heavy steel door above ground. The metal had been completely pristine on the inside. It was a high-security device disguised as rusted garbage. It must have contained a concealed magnetic proximity sensor or a silent cellular tripwire. The exact second I turned that key, the security system sent an automated alert directly to Trent's private network. But as the heavy cables continued to grind above us, I realized a crucial detail. Trent had no idea that my parents had slipped the property deed and the iron key into my inheritance envelope. The estate attorney had handled the distribution behind closed doors. Trent had laughed at the deed without actually reading the parcel numbers. Therefore, my brother did not know I was the one standing in the bunker. He likely assumed a random urban explorer or an aggressive copper thief had broken the perimeter lock, because Trent believed this was a simple break and he would never risk coming here personally. A man with a $40 million public empire does not confront desperate criminals in the middle of the night. He delegates. He would have dispatched his highly paid private security contractors. They were not coming down here to ask polite questions. They were coming to quietly dispose of a trespasser and secure his darkest secret. I grabbed Clara by the shoulders, forcing her to look at me. I kept my voice low and completely steady. I told her that Trent was not in that elevator. I explained that heavily armed men were coming down to sweep the room and we had less than 60 seconds to disappear. Clara shook her head frantically. She pointed to the thick concrete walls and whispered that there was no other way out. She said the elevator was the only exit in the entire facility. I refused to accept that as a mathematical truth. A high-end underground fallout shelter buried 60 feet beneath a contaminated chemical swamp could not rely on a single elevator shaft for survival. The building codes for subterranean structures, even illegal ones, required massive industrial ventilation to prevent carbon dioxide poisoning. Furthermore, the swamp above us flooded every single autumn. A bunker this deep required a gravity-fed storm drainage system to prevent water pressure from cracking the foundation. There had to be an intake pipe large enough to move massive volumes of air and water, I ran my eyes over the architectural layout of the living space. The kitchen, the sitting area, the bedroom hallway all featured standard ceiling vents. But the expansive library area on the right side of the room caught my attention. The massive oak bookshelves were built directly against the far concrete wall, but they were spaced roughly 6 inches away from the baseboards to prevent mold. I rushed over to the shelves and dropped to my knees. Shining my phone flashlight under the bottom shelf, I saw a heavy bolted steel grate set into the concrete floor. It was an industrial air return tunnel leading directly into the old municipal chemical drainage network. I jammed my fingers under the bottom of the heavy oak bookcase. I planted my wet shoes against the faux hardwood floor and pushed upward with every ounce of strength I possessed. My muscles burned and my lower back screamed in pain, but the massive wooden structure slowly scraped forward across the floor, revealing the steel grate. The vibration from the elevator shaft suddenly slowed. The heavy steel cabin was arriving at the bottom of the chute. I frantically reached into my pockets, searching for a tool. I pulled out my metal pen and wedged it beneath the corner of the heavy steel grate. I pried upward using the concrete edge for leverage. The thick metal pins snapped out of their brackets with a loud pop. I pulled the heavy grate aside, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel sloping steeply upward into the freezing black void. A rush of cold, foul-smelling swamp air poured into the warm living room. The electronic chime of the elevator echoed through the hallway. The pneumatic doors began to slide open with a sharp hiss. I grabbed Clara by the hand and practically shoved her into the dark opening. She scrambled into the narrow tunnel, her cashmere sweater catching on the rough concrete edges. I climbed in right behind her, pulling the heavy steel grate back into place over our heads, just as the sound of heavy, tactical boots hit the hardwood floor of the bunker. I held my breath, pressing my body flat against the cold, damp floor of the tunnel. Through the slats of the metal grate, I could see the beams of powerful tactical flashlights sweeping across the library ceiling. 3 men stepped into the living room. They were dressed in unmarked black tactical gear, carrying suppressed compact rifles. They moved with absolute military precision, sweeping the kitchen and the bedroom corridors in total silence. They were professional fixers paid to clean up messes. One of the men barked a sharp command. He walked over to the center of the living room and stopped. He pointed his flashlight at the floor. My heart completely stopped. Sitting on the pristine hardwood right next to the coffee table was my dropped cell phone. Its screen was shattered, but it was clearly a modern device. The lead contractor picked up the phone. He pressed a button on his tactical radio and spoke in a low, harsh voice. He reported to a central dispatcher that the bunker had been compromised. He confirmed that the captive target was missing from the sofa. He requested an immediate trace on the serial numbers of the broken cellular device. My blood ran completely cold. I had just handed Trent my identity on a silver platter. The moment his security team ran the hardware numbers on that phone, they would know it belonged to me. Trent would know his invisible accounting brother had unlocked his vault and stolen his wife. The lead contractor ordered his men to tear the facility apart. He told them the intruders could not have gotten far. I nudged Clara forward in the absolute pitch-black darkness of the tunnel. We began to crawl. The air inside the old chemical drainage pipe was suffocatingly thick, smelling of rotting leaves and ancient industrial waste. The incline was incredibly steep, making every forward movement an agonizing physical struggle. Clara's muscles were severely atrophied from 6 years of confinement in a small underground box. She was gasping for air, her hands slipping on the slimy concrete. I had to position myself directly behind her, pushing her forward by her waist while digging the toes of my ruined dress shoes into the tunnel walls for traction. We climbed blindly for what felt like hours, but was likely only 15 minutes. The tunnel grew narrower, and the freezing rainwater began to trickle down the walls, soaking our clothes. We were climbing directly up toward the swamp surface. The sounds of the security team searching the bunker faded away, replaced by the loud drumming of the torrential storm above us. Finally, my hand struck a heavy iron barrier. It was a massive storm-drain cover blocked by years of accumulated mud and dead branches. I pushed Clara to the side and drove my shoulder into the iron grate. I hit it once, twice, 3 times. The rusted bolts finally gave way. The heavy iron cover flipped backward into the mud. Freezing rain poured down into the tunnel, striking my face. I pulled myself out of the drain and reached back down, grabbing Clara by her arms. I hauled her up over the edge. She collapsed into the thick, freezing mud, gasping for air, her clothes completely ruined. We had emerged in a deep drainage ditch roughly 50 yards outside the chain-link perimeter fence. I crawled up the muddy embankment and peered through the tall, dead grass. Parked directly in front of the rusted iron gates were two massive, unmarked black tactical trucks. Their engines were idling loudly, cutting through the sound of the pouring rain. The headlights were turned off to avoid attracting local attention. One of the contractors was standing outside the driver's side door of the second truck holding a large black umbrella and scanning the tree line with thermal binoculars. I quickly analyzed our massive disadvantage. I could not go back for my own car. I had parked it near the entrance. The contractors had definitely seen it. Trent's team would run my license plates and track my vehicle registration within minutes. If I tried to start my car, they would gun me down before I reached the highway. We had absolutely no money. We had no cellular communication. We were freezing, exhausted, and entirely exposed. We needed one of those tactical trucks. It was our only ticket out of the wasteland. I gestured for Clara to stay completely silent and low in the freezing mud. I crept through the tall grass, circling wide around the perimeter fence to approach the vehicles from the rear blind spot. The storm was our only tactical advantage. The heavy rain masked the sound of my footsteps snapping dead twigs. I reached the back bumper of the second idling truck. The contractor with the thermal binoculars stepped away from the door, walking toward the front gate to check on a radio transmission from the men inside the bunker. He left his heavy umbrella resting against the driver's side mirror. It was a window of exactly 10 seconds. I sprinted from the grass, grabbing the driver's side door handle. I threw the door open and threw myself into the heavy leather seat. I leaned across the massive center console and shoved the passenger door open. I hissed at Clara to move. She scrambled out of the muddy ditch, her soaked clothes heavy with dirt. She threw herself into the passenger seat, pulling the door shut behind her. The contractor heard the slam of the metal door. He spun around, dropping his radio and reaching for the holster on his tactical vest. He shouted a warning and charged toward the hood of the truck. I did not hesitate. I grabbed the heavy gear shifter and slammed it into drive. I stomped my wet shoe onto the accelerator pedal, pinning it entirely to the floorboards. The massive engine roared to life with terrifying power. The heavy off-road tires spun in the thick mud, throwing a geyser of dirt backward before catching solid traction. The truck lunged forward like a massive battering ram. The contractor threw himself out of the way, diving into the flooded ditch to avoid being crushed beneath the heavy steel grille. I wrestled the steering wheel, forcing the heavy vehicle onto the rutted gravel path leading away from the property. I kept the headlights completely off, driving totally blind through the intense darkness, relying only on the faint flashes of lightning to guide the truck down the narrow path. I did not turn the headlights on until we finally reached the paved asphalt of the main county highway miles away from the compound. The adrenaline slowly began to recede from my veins, leaving behind a cold, sharp reality. The heater inside the massive tactical truck blasted hot air over us, but Clara could not stop shivering. She sat curled in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing world. We merged onto the interstate, heading away from the city of Chicago. The bright neon lights of gas stations, the sweeping headlights of passing semi-trucks, the sprawling, massive expanse of the dark sky. It was all too much. After spending 6 years trapped in a silent, windowless beige box, the sheer, chaotic noise and infinite scale of the outside world was acting like a physical assault on her brain. She covered her ears with her muddy hands, pressing her eyes tightly shut. She began to cry again, overwhelmed by a massive sensory panic attack. I pulled the heavy truck onto the shoulder of an abandoned rest stop, turning off the engine. The sudden silence brought a small measure of peace to the cab. I reached across the center console and placed a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. I told her to take deep breaths. I promised her that no one was going to put her back in that concrete box. I swore to her that Trent was never going to touch her again. As I sat there looking at the traumatized heiress my brother had buried alive, my own identity fundamentally shifted. I was no longer just the passive, invisible forensic accountant who fixed his mistakes. Trent had pushed me completely off the board. He had made me a fugitive. He had stolen my entire life. And right at this very moment, his private security team was calling him to report that his captive wife had escaped in a stolen truck driven by his own flesh and blood. Trent finally knew exactly who his enemy was. He knew his dark empire was entirely exposed. I put the truck back into gear and merged onto the dark, empty highway. We were completely off the grid, hunted by billionaires and private mercenaries. We could not run away forever. The only way to survive was to follow the blood money directly to the source and publicly execute the king. The hunt had officially begun. The sun began to bleed through the heavy storm clouds, casting a dull gray light across the flat, endless fields of the rural highway. My hands were gripping the steering wheel of the stolen tactical truck so tightly that my knuckles ached. We had been driving in absolute silence for over 4 hours, putting as much distance as possible between us and the toxic swamp. I constantly checked the rear-view mirror, expecting to see a fleet of black vehicles cresting the horizon, but the road remained completely empty. I knew the silence would not last. Trent had unlimited resources and a private army of fixers who were undoubtedly mobilizing a massive grid search. We needed to abandon the highly conspicuous military grade truck immediately. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a desolate truck stop on the edge of a forgotten Rust Belt town. Clara was asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the cold glass of the window. I left the engine running and walked into a dusty pawn shop located next to the gas station. The bell above the door chimed, announcing my arrival to a tired-looking man sitting behind a bulletproof glass partition. I took off my stainless steel chronograph watch. It was the only item of real value I had left to my name. I had purchased it to celebrate passing my professional licensing exams. The pawnbroker barely inspected the heavy metal band before offering me a fraction of its true value. I did not negotiate. I took the thin stack of $20 bills and walked back out into the freezing morning air. We abandoned the tactical truck behind a row of rusted shipping containers, hoping it would take the local authorities a few days to locate it. We walked a mile down the broken sidewalk until we reached a decaying roadside motel. The neon vacancy sign was buzzing loudly, flashing a harsh red light against the wet pavement. I walked into the cramped lobby and paid for a room using the cash from my watch. The desk clerk did not even ask for a driver license. He simply slid a brass key across the scratched laminate counter and turned his attention back to a small television. The motel room smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. The floral wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the heavy curtains blocked out the morning light almost entirely. Clara sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, staring blankly at the stained carpet. Her wet clothes were plastered to her skin, and she was trembling violently. I turned up the wall-mounted heating unit until the room felt like a furnace. I handed her a dry sweatshirt I had packed in my duffel bag before Trent's management company evicted me. Once she was warm, Clara looked at me and asked the question that had been hovering between us since we escaped the bunker. She asked why we did not just walk into a police station and tell them everything. She reasoned that her face was famous, and any detective would instantly recognize the missing heiress. I sat in the single creaking armchair across from the bed and took a deep breath. I had to explain the brutal political reality of the city we had left behind. I told her that walking into a local precinct would be an absolute death sentence. Over the last 6 years, Trent had carefully built an impenetrable wall of public goodwill. He had poured millions of dollars into the police union pension funds. He had personally purchased brand new fleets of patrol cruisers for the surrounding counties through his charitable foundation. The chief of police attended my brother's private golf tournaments and sat in his luxury box at charity galas. If we walked into a station, the desk sergeant would immediately place a quiet phone call to his superiors. Within 20 minutes, Trent's private security contractors would walk through the back door of the precinct, and we would simply disappear forever. Trent owned the law. The only way to defeat a man who buys the system is to completely bankrupt him. I unzipped my damp duffel bag and pulled out my professional laptop. It was a high-performance machine loaded with heavy encrypted accounting software. I plugged the power cord into a loose wall outlet and sat at the small wobbly desk in the corner of the motel room. I connected to the motel's unsecured wireless internet network, immediately routing my connection through a series of international virtual private networks to mask my physical location. I was about to attempt something highly illegal, but the rules of corporate compliance no longer applied to a man running for his life. During my 7 years at the forensic accounting firm, I had handled the most sensitive financial data for our wealthiest corporate clients. When the firm migrated their server architecture 3 years ago, I was the senior auditor in charge of verifying the data transfer. Because I am inherently meticulous, I had quietly created a hidden administrative backdoor in the server directory. It was a simple line of code buried deep in the registry, designed to allow me remote access in case of a catastrophic system failure. I never intended to use it for corporate espionage, but I also never intended to become a hunted fugitive. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the complex sequence of login credentials. A black terminal window appeared on my screen. A green cursor blinked twice. Access granted. I was instantly inside the central nervous system of my former accounting firm. I completely bypassed the standard employee firewalls and dropped directly into the master client directory. I located the massive digital file labeled under Trent's primary real estate holding company. The sheer volume of the financial data was staggering. There were thousands of interconnected ledger entries offshore, holding accounts, shell companies structured as limited liability partnerships, and complex tax diversion schemes. To an untrained eye, the spreadsheets looked like a brilliant, flawless tapestry of massive corporate wealth. But I was not an untrained eye. I was the architect who used to fix his mistakes. I knew exactly how Trent disguised his careless spending. I cracked my knuckles and began to perform a deep forensic audit of my own family. I started by tracing the massive influx of capital that had occurred exactly 3 weeks ago. It was the exact timeline Clara had given me regarding the release of her $50 million blind trust. Sure enough, I found a colossal wire transfer originating from a state probate court escrow account. The money had landed in Trent's primary corporate operating account, but it did not stay there for long. Trent had immediately begun shuffling the funds through a maze of subsidiary accounts. He was trying to wash the money, blending it with legitimate rental income from his commercial properties. I isolated the $50 million and began following the individual money trails. Forensic accounting is not about looking at the large, obvious numbers. It is about hunting for the tiny discrepancies that do not make logical sense. I spent 4 hours locked in absolute concentration, scrolling through endless rows of transactional data. Clara sat quietly on the bed, watching me work, the only sound in the room being the rapid clicking of my keyboard and the humming of the cheap wall heater. The first major anomaly I found was a recurring monthly payment labeled as a high-level environmental consulting fee. The payments were massive, exceeding $80,000 a month. They were being wired to a completely obscure limited liability company registered in the state of Florida. Trent's real estate empire operated entirely in the Midwest. He had absolutely no active construction projects in Florida that would require a multi-million-dollar environmental consultant. I opened a secondary window and ran the Florida company through a federal business registry database. The company had been incorporated exactly 6 years ago. The timeline was a perfect match to the month Clara supposedly vanished. The corporate officers were hidden behind a registered agent service, but the primary business address was listed as a private waterfront estate in Miami. I pulled up county property tax records for that specific address. The house had been purchased in cash by a man named Gregory. I stared at the name on the screen, my pulse quickening. I opened a news archive database and searched for the name Gregory alongside the details of Clara's fatal hit-and-run accident. The search results populated instantly. My breath caught in my throat. Gregory was the name of the grieving pedestrian who had supposedly been struck and killed by Clara's luxury vehicle 6 years ago. The media had reported his tragic death for weeks, claiming his poor family was left entirely destitute. But Gregory was not dead. He was alive and exceptionally well-funded. Trent had not just faked a crime scene. He had purchased a willing participant. He had found a man willing to fake his own violent death in exchange for an $80,000 monthly retainer and a waterfront mansion in Florida. The hit-and-run victim was nothing more than a highly paid crisis actor living comfortably on a shell corporation payroll. The continuous paper trail of bloody bribes was sitting right in front of me, perfectly documented in Trent's own corporate ledgers. I turned in my chair and looked at Clara. I explained exactly what I had just found. I told her the man she supposedly killed was currently enjoying early retirement on a beach. The immense relief that washed over her pale face was overwhelming. The crushing guilt she had carried for 6 years, the agonizing belief that she had taken an innocent life was entirely, completely eradicated in a matter of seconds. She covered her face with her hands, weeping quietly, but this time the tears were born of absolute liberation instead of pure terror. I turned back to the glowing screen, diving even deeper into the financial labyrinth. I continued to trace the $50 million from the stolen trust fund. What I discovered next completely dismantled the myth of my powerful golden brother. Trent had always portrayed himself as a brilliant, aggressive developer who multiplied our parents' legacy into a billion-dollar empire. The truth was violently different. Trent was an absolute failure. Every single commercial property he owned was drowning in severe toxic debt. He had taken out massive predatory loans using his existing properties as collateral to fund new disastrous construction projects. He had engaged in a continuous, reckless cycle of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. When Clara disappeared 6 years ago, he did not use her money to build an empire. He could not access her trust fund yet. He had to wait the mandatory legal period for her to be declared dead in absentia. To survive those 6 years, Trent had continuously lied on his federal loan applications, inflating the value of his properties and showing fraudulent projected revenue to secure extension loans from major banking institutions. He had committed rampant aggressive wire fraud and bank fraud on a federal level. The moment the state judge finally released Clara's $50 million to him 3 weeks ago, Trent had immediately used every single penny to pay off the explosive balloon payments on his predatory loans. He did not invest the money. He used it to plug the massive gaping holes in the hull of his sinking ship. I leaned back in the creaking motel chair, staring at the screen in pure disbelief. Trent's entire $40 million real estate empire. The legacy he had flaunted at the will. Reading the power he used to evict me and destroy my career was a complete, absolute illusion. He owned nothing. His entire corporate structure was a house of cards balanced precariously on the stolen blood money of a kidnapped woman. The financial reality meant something incredibly dangerous for my brother. Trent was walking a tightrope over an active volcano. He was completely dependent on Clara's legal status remaining dead. If anyone discovered that Clara was alive, her $50 million trust fund would have to be immediately returned to her by federal law. The major banks would demand their money back. Trent no longer had the cash to pay them because he had already spent it servicing his fraudulent debts. If Clara simply walked into a courtroom breathing and alive, Trent would default on hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate loans overnight. The federal government would immediately seize his properties. The Securities and Exchange Commission would audit his fraudulent applications. The FBI would investigate the massive bribery payments sent to the fake victim in Florida. Trent would not just lose his money. He would face 100 lifetimes in a maximum security federal penitentiary. That was exactly why his private tactical team was hunting us with such lethal desperation. We were not just an inconvenience. We represented the absolute total destruction of Trent's universe. He could not simply silence us. He had to erase us from existence before I could download the ledgers. I highlighted the most damaging financial documents. I selected the wire transfer records to the Florida shell company, the fraudulent bank loan applications, and the internal emails detailing the fake environmental consulting fees. I initiated a secure encrypted download, saving the massive data packages directly to my external hard drive. The progress bar on my screen slowly ticked forward, agonizingly pacing out our survival. I realized that taking this information to the local police was useless, but taking it to a federal judge was our only path forward. We needed to bypass the corrupted local precinct and strike Trent on a stage so incredibly massive he could not buy his way out of the spotlight. I unplugged the hard drive as the download completed, slipping it securely into my jacket pocket. We had the weapon. Now we needed the perfect battlefield to execute the king. The harsh morning light bled through the frayed edges of the motel curtains. I sat at the wobbly desk, my eyes burning from staring at the downloaded financial ledgers all night. Clara was finally asleep on the faded bedspread. I reached for the cheap plastic remote and turned on the small television mounted in the corner, keeping the volume barely above a whisper. I needed to see if the local news had picked up the story of a stolen tactical truck. What I saw instead made the blood freeze completely in my veins. Every major national news network was broadcasting a live press conference from the steps of the downtown Chicago police headquarters. Standing at the podium, flanked by the chief of police and heavily armed tactical officers, was my brother. Trent was wearing a dark conservative suit, his tie slightly loosened to give the appearance of a man who had been up all night in frantic distress. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white, his head bowed. When he finally looked up at the cameras, his eyes were red and brimming with tears. It was a flawless, terrifying performance. Trent leaned into the microphone and delivered a narrative so perfectly twisted it took my breath away. He told the world that a severe family tragedy had just occurred. He claimed that his younger brother Travis had suffered a massive psychological breakdown following the sudden death of our parents. Trent painted a picture of a deeply unstable, bitterly jealous man who could not handle being left out of the family business. He told the reporters that in a fit of violent delusion, I had broken into a secure private medical facility owned by his company. He stated that I had brutally attacked the security staff and kidnapped a vulnerable, innocent female patient who was receiving specialized care. Trent did not mention Clara by name. He deliberately kept her identity vague, referring to her only as a fragile woman who desperately needed medical attention. He warned the public that I was highly dangerous, completely unhinged, and armed. Then he delivered the final crushing blow. With a perfectly timed sob, Trent looked directly into the camera lens and announced a private cash reward of $100,000 for any information leading directly to my capture. I felt the air get sucked out of the cramped motel room. Trent had weaponized the entire country against us. He had brilliantly preempted our move. If Clara and I walked into a police station now, the officers would not see a rescued kidnapping victim and a whistleblower. They would see a violently unhinged man who had just abducted a psychiatric patient. The $100,000 bounty ensured that every citizen, every motel clerk, and every desperate bounty hunter in a 500-mile radius would be looking for my face. Clara stirred awake on the bed, her eyes fluttering open just in time to hear Trent pleading for her safe return on the broadcast. The sheer manipulation of his voice sent her into an immediate violent panic. She scrambled against the headboard, pulling her knees to her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid. I quickly turned the television off and knelt beside the bed. I promised her that we were not going to let him control the narrative, but internally, I was terrifyingly aware of how fast our options were shrinking. We could not outrun a national manhunt. We needed federal intervention. We needed an agency completely outside of Trent's local sphere of financial influence. The local field office was compromised, but I knew someone who had direct channels to the federal authorities. I grabbed my encrypted laptop and closed it, shoving it into my duffel bag. I told Clara we had to leave the motel immediately. We slipped out the back door and walked 2 miles down the rural highway until we found an ancient rusted payphone sitting outside an abandoned laundromat. I dropped a handful of coins into the slot and dialed a number I had memorized years ago. I called Harrison. Harrison was my former mentor at the accounting firm. Despite firing me the previous morning under Trent's direct orders, Harrison was fundamentally a man who respected the law. During his decades in corporate auditing, he had built a network of close contacts within the white-collar crime division of the FBI. If anyone could get my encrypted hard drive directly onto the desk of a federal prosecutor without Trent intercepting it, it was Harrison. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. He sounded exhausted. I did not give him time to speak. I spoke rapidly, telling him that I was not crazy, that Trent was running a massive fraud operation, and that I had the raw data to prove it. I told him I had the digital ledgers, the offshore shell company routing numbers, and the absolute proof of bribery. I begged him to listen to me swearing on my life that the press conference was a complete fabrication, designed to cover up a horrific crime. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Harrison breathing heavily. Finally, he spoke. His voice was trembling. He told me he believed me. He said Trent had been acting completely erratic all morning, demanding that the firm scrub certain accounts. Harrison sounded terrified, but he agreed to help. He told me he could not risk meeting anywhere near the city because Trent had private security swarming the downtown area. Harrison instructed me to meet him at a specific location. It was a dilapidated roadside diner located near an old state route border crossing about 40 miles from our current location. He promised he would come alone, collect the hard drive, and personally drive it to his contact at the Federal Bureau. A wave of profound relief washed over me. I thanked him, hung up the heavy receiver, and turned to Clara. I told her we finally had a lifeline. We spent the next 2 hours moving carefully through the rural backroads. We avoided the main highways entirely, sticking to dirt paths and forgotten access roads to stay out of sight. The gray morning slowly dragged into a bleak, overcast afternoon. Every passing vehicle made my stomach tighten. I watched Clara out of the corner of my eye. The initial panic from the television broadcast had settled into a hardened, quiet resolve. She was no longer just the terrified captive I had pulled out of the underground bunker. She was watching the tree lines, calculating our surroundings, surviving. We finally reached the rendezvous point. The diner was exactly as Harrison had described. It was a run-down single-story building with faded aluminum siding and a cracked asphalt parking lot. A rusted neon sign flickered weakly in the dim afternoon light. There were only 3 vehicles in the lot. 2 of them were beat-up local pickup trucks, and the third was a silver sedan that I instantly recognized. It belonged to Harrison. I parked our stolen tactical truck deep in a grove of pine trees behind the diner, completely out of sight from the main road. I told Clara to wait in the cab, keep the engine idling, and lock the heavy steel doors. If anything went wrong, she was to drive straight to the nearest state border and never look back. She grabbed my arm before I could step out into the rain. She looked me dead in the eye and told me to come back. I nodded, zipped my damp jacket over the hard drive, and walked through the muddy brush toward the back entrance of the diner. The interior of the restaurant smelled of old frying oil and stale coffee. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, irritating hum. I walked through the swinging kitchen doors and stepped into the main dining area. There were no other customers. The cook was nowhere to be seen. Sitting in a booth at the far end of the room was Harrison. He was wearing a wrinkled trench coat, clutching a porcelain coffee mug with both hands. He looked up when I approached the table, but he did not smile. His face was completely drained of color. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him, reaching into my jacket to retrieve the encrypted hard drive. I started to thank him for taking the risk, but the words died in my throat the moment I looked deeply into his eyes. Harrison was sweating profusely. His eyes darted nervously toward the large glass windows facing the highway. He was not looking at me. He was waiting for something else. A sickening realization dropped like a stone in my stomach. I stopped reaching for the drive. I asked him in a quiet, dead voice what he had done. Harrison let out a pathetic, broken sob. He told me he was so sorry. He confessed that right after we spoke on the payphone, Trent had walked directly into his office. Trent did not just threaten his business. Trent threatened his family. My brother told Harrison that if he did not cooperate, His entire life would be dismantled, his pensions drained, and his children targeted. Harrison was a brilliant accountant, but he was a coward when faced with absolute physical intimidation. He had given Trent the exact coordinates of our meeting. Before Harrison could finish his pathetic apology, the low rumble of heavy diesel engines vibrated through the floorboards of the diner. I turned my head just in time to see 3 massive black tactical vehicles violently jump the curb and skid into the parking lot. They blocked the front entrance entirely. Heavily armed private security contractors began pouring out of the vehicles, weapons raised, fanning out to secure the perimeter. Trent had not sent the police. He had sent his executioners. There was absolutely no time to negotiate or scream at Harrison. I kicked the table upward with brutal force, sending hot coffee and ceramic shards flying directly into his chest. The heavy wooden table flipped over, creating a momentary barricade between the front windows and my position. The front glass of the diner shattered violently. The security team did not even bother issuing a warning. They used a heavy breaching ram to smash through the double glass doors, sending jagged shards spraying across the vinyl booths and checkered floor. I threw myself backward, rolling behind the thick wooden counter of the diner as boots pounded against the floorboards. I crawled frantically through the kitchen area, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. A contractor in dark tactical gear kicked open the swinging kitchen door, his weapon raised, sweeping the corners. I lunged from the shadows, swinging the heavy iron skillet with everything I had. It struck the side of his helmet with a sickening crunch. The man collapsed instantly, his rifle clattering across the greasy tiles. I did not stop moving. I sprinted out the rear exit door just as a second contractor rounded the corner and shouted a command. I burst out into the freezing rain, my boots slipping wildly on the wet gravel. I sprinted toward the dense grove of pine trees where I had parked the truck. Clara was already in the driver's seat. She had seen the tactical vehicles pull in and had moved behind the wheel. The engine was roaring. I threw open the passenger door and dove inside head first. I screamed at her to hit the gas. Clara slammed her foot onto the accelerator. The massive tires ripped through the mud and tore through the thick brush, crushing small trees beneath the heavy steel bumper. Gunfire echoed through the rain. The sharp, terrifying ping of bullets struck the reinforced steel tailgate of our truck, but the military-grade armor held firm. Clara navigated the treacherous terrain with absolute pure survival instinct, forcing the truck back onto a hidden logging road and disappearing into the dense, dark woods before the contractors could turn their vehicles around to pursue us. We drove for miles in complete silence. My chest heaved as I struggled to pull oxygen into my burning lungs. The adrenaline was slowly fading, leaving behind a sharp, terrifying clarity. I looked over at Clara. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were stark white, but her jaw was set. She was not crying. She was furious. I realized then how completely outmatched we were in a traditional game of evasion. We could not run. Trent had unlimited money. He had the local police force in his pocket. He had an army of mercenaries willing to gun us down in broad daylight. He had national media networks painting me as a psychotic kidnapper. Any friend or ally I tried to contact would be threatened, bought off, or completely destroyed. There was no safe harbor left in the entire country. If we kept running, Trent would eventually find us, and he would bury us both permanently. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the encrypted hard drive. The massive financial ledgers, the fraudulent loan documents, the shell company routing numbers, the definitive proof of his bribes. It was a digital bomb. But a bomb is completely useless if you detonate it in an empty forest. We could not just hand this over to a random federal agent. Trent would hire a dozen high-powered defense attorneys to drag the investigation out for years, while his security team quietly hunted us down. I looked at the hard drive, and then I looked at Clara. The realization settled over me with absolute certainty. We could not fight a shadow war against a billionaire. We had to drag this fight out into the blinding, unforgiving light of the public arena. We needed a stage so incredibly massive, so universally watched, and so deeply public that Trent could not possibly buy his way out of the execution. We had to take the empire he stole and publicly burn it to the ground with him locked inside it. We were sitting in the stolen tactical truck hidden deep within a dense grove of rotting pine trees just off the interstate. The silence in the cab was suffocating. I gripped the heavy steering wheel, my mind running through a rapidly shrinking list of potential allies. Every colleague, every judge, every local politician in Chicago was either on Trent's payroll or too terrified to cross him. I was about to suggest fleeing across the northern border when Clara spoke up. Her voice was remarkably steady, considering she had just crawled out of a muddy drainage pipe after 6 years in a concrete box. She told me there was exactly one man on earth who possessed the resources, the legal authority, and the sheer absolute hatred for my brother necessary to destroy him. His name was Walter Montgomery. Clara explained that Walter was her late grandfather's personal trust attorney. He was an old-money New York bulldog, a man who operated entirely on ruthless principles and unwavering loyalty to her family lineage. When Trent first started courting Clara years ago, Walter had openly despised him, calling my brother a hollow corporate parasite to his face. Trent had spent years trying to get Walter removed from managing the massive blind trust, but the old man was legally immovable. If there was one person in the country who would eagerly drop a nuclear bomb on Trent's real estate empire, it was Walter Montgomery. But Walter lived in a Manhattan brownstone nearly 800 miles away. We were sitting in a highly conspicuous security truck that was practically glowing on police radar. We had almost no cash, and our faces were currently being broadcast on every news channel in the country as part of Trent's vicious smear campaign. I drove the truck to an abandoned strip mall, wiping down the steering wheel to eliminate fingerprints. We walked 3 miles in the freezing rain to a dilapidated bus station. I used the remaining cash from my pawned watch to buy 2 one-way tickets to New York under fabricated names. The cross-country journey was an agonizing test of physical and mental endurance. We sat in the very back of the cramped-smelling bus with our hoods pulled low over our faces. Every time a highway patrol cruiser sped past our window, my heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. But watching Clara was even more heartbreaking. After 6 years locked in a beige, silent room, the sheer velocity of the passing world completely overwhelmed her senses. She kept her eyes squeezed tightly shut, her hands gripping her knees until her knuckles turned stark white. I sat rigidly beside her, acting as a physical shield between her and the other passengers. We survived on stale vending machine crackers and tap water, sleeping in shifts and jumping at every sudden noise. The paranoia was eating away at my sanity, but the heavy hard drive sitting in my jacket pocket kept my focus entirely sharp. We carried the ultimate weapon. We just needed to deliver it. We arrived at the Port Authority terminal in Manhattan just after midnight on the second day. The city was a chaotic ocean of blaring sirens and blinding neon lights, creating a sharp, terrifying contrast to the silent swamp we had escaped. We navigated the subway system, keeping our heads down until we reached the upscale, quiet streets of the Upper East Side. Walter lived in a multi-million-dollar historic brownstone, shielded by heavy iron gates and sophisticated alarm systems. Ringing the front doorbell at 2 a.m. was simply not an option. If Walter panicked and called the police, Trent's private security network would intercept the local dispatch within minutes. We had to get inside silently. I spent a decade auditing high-end commercial real estate properties. I know exactly how these historic buildings are wired for security. I bypassed the magnetic lock on the rear alley gate using a simple piece of heavy wire I scavenged from a nearby trash can. We slipped quietly into the small brick courtyard. The back kitchen door was secured with a modern electronic deadbolt, but the basement coal chute was secured with a standard outdated iron latch. I pried the rusted metal open, forcing my body through the narrow gap and dropping onto the cold stone floor below. I reached up and helped Clara down, and we crept silently up the wooden servant stairs into the dark sleeping house. The interior smelled of expensive leather, old paper, and polished mahogany. We moved like ghosts through the grand hallway until we saw a sliver of warm light spilling from the crack of a set of heavy double doors. It was the home office. I took a deep breath and gently pushed the wooden door open. Walter Montgomery was sitting behind a massive desk illuminated by a single brass reading lamp. He was a stern, silver-haired man with sharp, unforgiving features, dressed in a thick velvet robe while reviewing a stack of legal documents. I stepped into the light. Walter froze instantly. His sharp eyes locked onto my face, and he recognized me immediately from the national television broadcasts. He reached slowly toward the top drawer of his desk, his jaw clenching with absolute terror and aggressive anger. He told me in a low, deadly whisper that if I took one more step, he would shoot me dead right there on his imported rug. He said he had already pressed the silent panic button mounted under his desk. I raised my hand slowly, showing him I was completely unarmed. I told him not to call the police. I swore to him that I had not kidnapped anyone and that the news reports were a complete fabrication. Before Walter could reach his weapon, Clara stepped out of the dark hallway and walked directly into the center of the illuminated room. The heavy silence that fell over the office was absolute. Walter stopped breathing entirely. His hand hovered inches above the open desk drawer, trembling violently. He stared at the woman he had treated like a surrogate granddaughter, the woman he had officially pronounced legally dead just 3 weeks ago. Clara offered him a small, broken smile and whispered his name. The formidable, ruthless New York attorney completely collapsed emotionally. He stumbled clumsily around the edge of the desk, his legs giving out as he fell to his knees on the rug in front of her. He grabbed her hands, staring into her pale, hollow face, and began sobbing openly like a child. He kept repeating that it was impossible. He said he had seen the forensic photographs of the wrecked car. He said he had stood in the rain and watched her husband bury an empty casket. Clara knelt on the floor beside him, holding his shaking shoulders, and told him the horrifying truth. She detailed the drugged wine, the concrete bunker, the 6 years of psychological torture, and the fabricated hit and run designed specifically to steal her massive trust fund. Walter listened to the gruesome details, his initial shock slowly morphing into a cold, terrifying rage. He stood up, his face hardening back into the ruthless, legal bulldog Clara had described. He looked at me, no longer seeing a desperate fugitive, but recognizing a vital ally. He demanded to know exactly what proof we had to back up these massive allegations. I pulled the encrypted hard drive from my jacket and set it heavily on his mahogany desk. I told him he was looking at the complete forensic financial audit of Trent's entire real estate empire. I booted up my laptop, connected the drive, and began pulling up the stolen ledgers. I walked Walter through the exact sequence of the monumental fraud. I showed him the offshore shell companies, the predatory commercial loans, the fabricated revenue reports, and the explosive balloon payments Trent had desperately covered using Clara's stolen inheritance. Then I opened the most damning file of all. I showed Walter the continuous massive monthly wire transfers sent directly to the Florida Shell Corporation. I cross-referenced the corporate officers with the county property tax records, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the victim of the fatal hit and run was currently alive and living in a luxurious beachfront mansion. Walter stared at the glowing screen, his eyes scanning the undeniable numbers. He did not say a single word for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet and laced with venom. He said, "My brother had not just committed corporate fraud. Trent had orchestrated a domestic terrorism campaign against his own family simply to protect a bankrupt empire." Walter looked up at me and asked what I wanted to do with the hard drive. I told him I wanted Trent to burn. I explained that taking this digital evidence to a random federal field office was far too risky. Trent had deep political connections and could easily buy enough time to destroy the original physical files, silence the fake victim in Florida, and put a bullet in both of our heads before a grand jury ever convened. We needed to execute a public strike so massive and undeniable that no amount of money could possibly suppress it. Walter slowly smiled. It was a vicious, predatory smile that sent a shiver down my spine. He walked over to his crystal liquor cabinet, poured a small measure of expensive scotch, and swallowed it in one sharp gulp. He told us we had arrived at his home at the exact perfect moment in history. He walked back to the desk and pulled a heavy, embossed cardstock envelope from a neat stack of incoming mail. He tossed it onto the keyboard of my laptop. It was an exclusive invitation to a massive, highly publicized charity gala hosted by my brother. The event was scheduled for tomorrow night at the grand ballroom of a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. Trent was formally launching a new philanthropic foundation supposedly built in honor of his late beloved wife, Clara. He was inviting the governor, the mayor, the district attorney, and every major national media network in the country to cover the emotional ribbon-cutting ceremony. Walter tapped his index finger aggressively against the invitation. He explained that this new foundation was nothing more than a highly sophisticated money laundering front. Trent was planning to funnel the remaining liquid assets from Clara's trust fund through the charity to legally wash the dirty money and protect it from any future federal tax audits. It was his final arrogant victory lap. He was using his murdered wife's memory to secure his own financial immunity in front of the entire nation. But Walter pointed out the fatal flaw in Trent's massive ego. By inviting the press, the politicians, and the chief law enforcement officers to a live televised event, Trent was building the exact public execution stage we desperately needed. Walter picked up his cell phone. He told us he was personal friends with the district attorney attending the gala. The district attorney was a highly ambitious man who had always been slightly suspicious of Trent's incredibly rapid rise to power, but he had never acquired the hard evidence necessary to launch a formal legal investigation. The strategy crystallized perfectly in my mind. We were not going to hand the hard drive to a junior agent in a quiet suburban office building. We were going to hijack the live broadcast. Walter promised to use his immense legal authority and vast financial resources to smuggle us safely back into Chicago on a private jet. He would personally coordinate with his own private security team to infiltrate the hotel catering staff, placing Clara and me directly inside the grand ballroom. The plan was brilliantly simple, but carried incredibly high stakes. While Trent was standing on stage weeping for the news cameras and cementing his false legacy, I would bypass the hotel audio-visual network from a hidden control room. I would project the irrefutable financial ledgers, the bribery payments, and the fraudulent death certificate directly onto the massive presentation screens behind him. And while the district attorney and the national press were scrambling to comprehend the massive scope of the fraud, Clara would step out from behind the velvet curtains. Trent had built a $40 million illusion on the fundamental premise that his wife was rotting away inside a toxic swamp. Tomorrow night we were going to let the entire world watch as a ghost walked out of the shadows to tear his entire empire down to the bare studs. The service elevator jolted forcefully as it carried us toward the grand ballroom of the luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. The cramped steel box smelled heavily of roasted meat and industrial floor cleaner. I adjusted the stiff collar of my crisp white catering shirt, trying to regulate my rapid breathing. Beside me, Clara stood perfectly still. She was wearing a matching black vest and carrying a stack of thick, folded table linens. Hidden carefully beneath her oversized catering apron was a stunning dark emerald evening gown. Walter had purchased the dress for her earlier that afternoon through a private boutique. He had also spent $50,000 in cash to bribe the corrupt director of event catering, ensuring our fabricated names were placed on the temporary staff roster. We were officially invisible cogs in the massive machine of my brother's charity gala. The heavy elevator doors slid open, revealing a chaotic staging area filled with rushing waiters and shouting culinary supervisors. We stepped out and seamlessly blended into the moving crowd. I grabbed a large silver tray lined with crystal champagne flutes while Clara kept her head down, clutching the linens to her chest. As we walked through the swinging wooden doors and entered the main ballroom, the sheer overwhelming volume of the event hit me like a physical wave. The opulence was absolutely sickening. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant golden light over hundreds of wealthy guests. A professional string quartet played soft classical music in the corner. The room was packed with the city elite, including local politicians, powerful real estate developers and national media correspondents holding large broadcast cameras. In the very center of the room, surrounded by a circle of admiring investors, stood Trent. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo, holding a glass of sparkling water and smiling with absolute supreme confidence. He looked exactly like a generous, grieving philanthropist. He looked like a king standing on top of his conquered mountain. He had absolutely no idea that his entire empire was completely hollow and built on the stolen blood money of the woman currently pouring champagne just 30 feet away from him. I watched Clara out of the corner of my eye as we navigated the crowded floor. She was serving drinks to people she had known intimately for years. She walked past women who had wept hysterically at her fabricated memorial service. She poured wine for men who were currently applauding her husband for his bravery. I could see the muscles in her jaw clenching with intense, righteous anger. She was terrified that someone would recognize her pale features beneath the harsh ballroom lighting, but the wealthy elite never actually look at the faces of the catering staff. They looked right through her, completely oblivious to the ghost standing in their presence. We had a very strict timeline to execute. The main presentation was scheduled to begin in exactly 20 minutes. Trent was going to step onto the main stage and formally announce the launch of his new philanthropic foundation. It was the perfect moment to execute our strike, but before I could project the undeniable financial ledgers onto the massive screens I needed to access the audio-visual control room located on the upper mezzanine, I gave Clara a brief subtle nod, signaling her to move toward the rear staging area behind the main curtains. I set my empty silver tray down on a passing busboy cart and slipped away from the crowded ballroom floor. I pushed through a set of heavy brass doors and entered a long, carpeted service hallway designated exclusively for hotel management and private security personnel. The corridor was completely quiet, allowing the pounding of my own heart to echo loudly in my ears. I walked swiftly toward the rear stairwell that led up to the mezzanine balcony. I was only 50 feet away from the stairwell doors when the handle of a private meeting room suddenly turned. The door swung open, and a massive man in a dark tailored suit stepped directly into the center of the hallway, blocking my path entirely. It was the lead tactical contractor from the toxic swamp. He was the mercenary who had nearly gunned us down the previous night. Trent had clearly promoted him to head of event security for the gala. The massive contractor stopped walking. He looked at my catering uniform, and then his eyes snapped up to my face. The recognition was instantaneous and absolute. He knew exactly who I was. He did not reach for his radio to call for backup. He reached directly inside his tailored suit jacket for his suppressed weapon, intending to kill me quietly right there in the empty corridor and drag my body into the meeting room. I did not wait for him to draw the gun. I am a forensic accountant, not a trained fighter, but absolute sheer desperation took total control of my body. I grabbed a heavy rolling utility cart parked against the wall filled with stacks of ceramic dinner plates. I shoved the cart forward with every single ounce of strength I possessed, driving it directly into the contractor's knees. The heavy metal edge of the cart struck him hard, causing his legs to buckle. He stumbled backward, crashing through the swinging doors of a massive, empty food prep kitchen. I charged through the doors right behind him, knowing that if I let him recover his balance, he would shoot me dead. The prep kitchen was a sprawling room filled with stainless steel tables, commercial ovens, and deep fryers. The contractor hit the wet tiled floor but immediately rolled onto his side, bringing his weapon up toward my chest. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet resting on the nearest stove and hurled it directly at his head. The iron pan slammed into his wrist, knocking the gun out of his hand. It skittered across the slippery wet tiles, sliding underneath a massive commercial oven. The contractor let out a low, furious growl and lunged at me. He tackled me around the waist, lifting me entirely off the ground and driving my spine brutally against the edge of a stainless steel prep table. The impact knocked the oxygen completely out of my lungs. My vision blurred violently into bright white flashes. He grabbed me by the throat with one massive hand, lifting me up and slamming my head down against the steel surface. He was incredibly strong, moving with lethal military precision. I kicked my legs wildly, trying to find any leverage on the slippery floor. My right hand flailed blindly across the prep table, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers brushed against a heavy industrial fire extinguisher mounted on a wall bracket just above the table. I gripped the red metal cylinder, ripped it free from the bracket, and swung it backward with brutal blind force. The heavy metal bottom of the extinguisher smashed directly into the side of his ribs. I heard a sharp crack as the bone gave way. The contractor grunted in severe pain, his grip on my throat loosening just enough for me to pull away. I dropped the extinguisher and delivered a desperate heavy kick directly to his shattered ribs. He stumbled backward, slipping on a pool of spilled cooking oil, and crashed violently into the heavy insulated door of a massive walk-in freezer. The metal latch of the freezer gave way under his massive weight, and the thick door swung open. The contractor tumbled backward into the freezing compartment, landing hard on the frost-covered floor, surrounded by hanging cuts of meat and stacked boxes of frozen produce. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I lunged forward, grabbing the heavy metal handle of the insulated freezer door, and slammed it shut with everything I had. The thick rubber seals locked into place with a heavy thud. I grabbed the exterior metal locking lever and pulled it downward, completely securing the heavy door from the outside. I leaned my entire body weight against the freezing metal, panting, frantically, my chest heaving, as I dragged desperately needed oxygen back into my lungs. Through the thick insulated walls, I could hear the muffled, frantic pounding of the contractor's fists striking the interior of the door. The temperature inside that specific storage unit was 20 degrees below zero. He could not shoot his way out through reinforced commercial steel, and his radio signal would be completely blocked by the thick metallic insulation. He was entirely neutralized, but the brutal physical altercation had cost me extremely valuable time. I pushed myself away from the freezer, wiping a smear of blood from my split lip. I checked my wristwatch. I had exactly 8 minutes before Trent walked onto the main stage to deliver his tragic keynote address to the nation. I smoothed down my wrinkled catering shirt, tucked my black vest back into my trousers, and sprinted out of the kitchen. I navigated through a narrow maze of back hallways until I reached the dark staging corridor located directly behind the grand ballroom presentation platform. The area was filled with coiled, thick black audio cables and stacked lighting crates. Clara was standing exactly where I told her to wait, hidden deeply in the shadows. She had removed her oversized catering apron, revealing the stunning dark emerald evening gown Walter had provided. Her blonde hair fell perfectly over her shoulders. She looked absolutely breathtaking, a living, flawless ghost preparing to step back into the world she had been brutally stolen from. She saw the blood on my mouth, and her eyes widened in alarm. She reached out her hands, trembling slightly, but I shook my head quickly. I whispered that the head of security was dealt with and that she was completely safe. I told her that she needed to take her final position. I guided Clara to a small gap between the heavy velvet curtains backing the main podium. Through the narrow slit in the fabric, we could see the back of the microphone stand and the massive bright projector screens towering over the stage. The murmuring voices of the wealthy crowd echoed loudly through the fabric. I looked Clara directly in the eyes. I told her that when she heard my voice coming through the ballroom speakers, she needed to step completely through the curtain and show her face to the cameras. She took a deep, steadying breath, her posture straightening with immense absolute dignity. She nodded once, signaling she was ready to reclaim her life. I left her standing in the dark and moved swiftly out into the main perimeter of the ballroom. I had one final crucial task to perform before I accessed the control room. If I exposed Trent's massive corporate fraud and revealed his kidnapped wife to the federal authorities on live television, he would instantly panic. A man facing decades in a federal penitentiary will attempt to run. I needed to ensure that Trent could not possibly flee the room when the ultimate trap finally snapped shut. I walked casually along the outer edges of the grand ballroom, keeping my face turned away from the prominent guests and the scattered security guards. I approached the heavy wooden double doors of the eastern fire exit. I reached into my pockets and pulled out 3 thick industrial-grade plastic zip ties I had stolen from a hardware store earlier that morning. Working with practiced, rapid precision, I looped the thick plastic bindings tightly around the twin metal push bars of the exit doors, pulling them completely flush and locking them together. The heavy doors were now utterly impossible to open from the inside. I moved to the western emergency exit and repeated the exact same process, securing the heavy metal push bars with the thick, unyielding plastic ties. I left only the main central entrance doors fully operational. Walter had already assured me that his own highly trained private security team was currently waiting patiently in the main lobby, standing directly outside those specific doors. They were under strict instructions to physically detain anyone attempting to leave the ballroom the moment the presentation was hijacked. Trent was now successfully trapped inside a gilded, locked cage of his own making. With the physical exits fully secured, I slipped into the rear stairwell and sprinted up the carpeted steps toward the mezzanine level. The audio-visual control room was a small glass-enclosed booth overlooking the entire expanse of the grand ballroom. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glowing monitors of the complex soundboards and the massive projection computers. A single young hotel technician was sitting in a rolling chair, wearing heavy headphones and scrolling idly through a tablet device. He had his back completely turned to the door. I walked quietly up behind him, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, and told him in a very calm, authoritative tone that there was a critical catering emergency involving a severe fire in the main prep kitchen. The young man ripped his headphones off his eyes wide with sudden panic and sprinted immediately out of the control booth, leaving the door wide open behind him. I stepped into the empty booth and locked the door, locking myself inside the technological nerve center of the entire gala. I looked through the large glass window down at the massive glittering crowd below. The string quartet had officially stopped playing. The low murmuring of the wealthy elite slowly faded into respectful silence. Down on the main floor, Trent separated himself from the group of admiring politicians. He straightened his midnight blue tuxedo jacket, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and began walking slowly and confidently up the short steps toward the grand, brightly lit stage. The camera crews adjusted their heavy lenses, focusing completely on his handsome, solemn face. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy, encrypted hard drive containing every single devastating secret of his fraudulent criminal empire. I plugged the digital weapon into the master projection terminal, watching the files load instantly onto my screen. The golden sun was finally standing at the very center of his stolen universe, completely ready to accept the adoration of the entire country. And I was standing in the shadows, completely ready to burn it all down. The grand ballroom of the luxury downtown hotel was bathed in a brilliant, warm, golden glow from the massive crystal chandeliers suspended high above the floor. The elegant string quartet playing in the corner slowly faded their music into absolute respectful silence as the main event commenced. The low murmuring of the wealthy elite died down completely when the heavy velvet curtains at the front of the enormous room shifted slightly. Trent walked out from the shadows and stepped onto the magnificent, brightly lit stage, looking like the absolute flawless picture of a modern, tragic hero. He wore his expensive midnight blue tuxedo with an effortless, charismatic grace, stepping up to the polished, clear acrylic podium. The television broadcast cameras lining the perimeter of the opulent room immediately swiveled and zoomed in on his face, capturing every single calculated nuance of his solemn expression. He gripped the smooth edges of the podium and looked out over the sprawling sea of powerful politicians, wealthy investors, and high society elites. He began to speak, and his deep, resonant voice echoed perfectly through the massive overhead concert speakers. He thanked every single person in the room for gathering together on such a profoundly emotional and difficult night. He spoke passionately about the heavy burden of grief and how the sudden violent loss of his beautiful, beloved wife Clara had nearly destroyed his entire will to live. He paused his speech with absolute perfect theatrical timing, letting a single fabricated tear slide slowly down his cheek. He wiped the tear away with the back of his hand, absorbing the massive collective wave of deep sympathy radiating from the captive audience. Sitting right in the front row was the district attorney, a highly ambitious man who nodded solemnly, completely buying into the magnificent, deceptive performance. Trent confidently declared that this new philanthropic foundation was specifically designed to turn his agonizing personal tragedy into brilliant public hope. He boldly claimed to the cameras that Clara's pure, gentle memory would live on forever through the tens of millions of dollars he was pledging to donate to the city infrastructure. He spun a beautiful, heartbreaking narrative about how much she loved helping the vulnerable and how he was simply acting as a humble vessel to carry out her final wishes. It was a flawless, utterly sickening masterpiece of absolute public deception. He was standing on a stage built entirely with her stolen trust fund, using her fabricated death to launder his dirty money right in front of the chief law enforcement officers of the state. I stood quietly in the darkened audio-visual control booth located on the mezzanine balcony, watching my brother spin his toxic criminal web over the entire country. The heavy encrypted hard drive I had removed from my jacket was securely plugged directly into the master presentation terminal. My fingers hovered gently just above the illuminated keys of the massive control board. I felt an incredible surging wave of pure adrenaline pumping rapidly through my chest. For my entire adult life, I had been the silent, invisible brother. I was the overlooked shadow who fixed his broken accounting ledgers and quietly cleaned up his careless financial disasters. I had allowed him and my parents to take the credit, the glory, and the massive real estate empire. But standing in that quiet technological bunker, I finally understood the true, undeniable power of being completely invisible. The people who operate entirely in the shadows are the only ones who can clearly see the structural flaws hiding beneath the blinding bright lights. Trent was elegantly wrapping up his deeply fraudulent national monologue. He reached to his side and raised a crystal glass of sparkling water, offering a beautifully worded, heartfelt toast to the ghost of the woman he had secretly buried alive in a toxic underground swamp. The wealthy crowd began to rise to their feet, preparing to deliver a massive, roaring standing ovation. It was the exact, absolute zenith of his entire fraudulent criminal existence. He was seconds away from securing permanent financial immunity and immortalizing himself as a tragic saint. I took a slow, deep, stabilizing breath and pressed my finger down firmly on the primary execute key on the control board. The booming audio feed from Trent's microphone was instantly completely severed. The sudden, unexpected silence in the grand ballroom was incredibly jarring. Trent tapped the silver head of the microphone twice, looking instantly annoyed. He gestured subtly toward the back of the room, expecting the hotel technical staff to quickly rush in and fix the embarrassing glitch. The standing crowd shifted uncomfortably, lowering their crystal glasses in confusion. Before Trent could lean forward to apologize for the technical difficulty, the massive digital projection system suspended high above the stage roared to life. The 3 towering screens positioned directly behind him flashed blindingly bright white before displaying the very first piece of undeniable forensic evidence. It was a massive, high-resolution scan of the fraudulent death certificate officially stamped and signed by the state probate court judge. Directly below the morbid certificate, I had projected the hidden bank routing numbers showing the exact chronological moment the $50 million blind trust fund was illegally absorbed into Trent's personal corporate accounts. The wealthy guests squinted at the massive glowing screens, trying desperately to comprehend the dense, complex financial documents looming over the stage. Trent turned around to look at the screens, and his entire body visibly stiffened in sheer terror. I did not give him a single second to mentally recover. I immediately triggered the next slide in the sequence. The screens instantly shifted to display the highly classified architectural blueprints of the subterranean concrete bunker located at Blackwood Creek. The detailed engineering schematics clearly showed the heavy steel vault doors, the massive industrial air filtration units, and the precise GPS coordinates pointing directly to the condemned toxic wasteland. I had meticulously overlaid the blueprints with the corresponding shell company invoices, proving exactly how my parents and my brother had secretly funneled millions of dollars to fund the illegal underground construction. The murmurs in the opulent ballroom began to escalate rapidly into sharp, highly confused whispers. I quickly advanced the presentation to the absolute most devastating piece of digital evidence. The screens now displayed the continuous monthly wire transfers sent directly from Trent's corporate operating accounts to the obscure limited liability company registered in Florida. Beside the massive wire transfers, I projected a crystal-clear photograph of the luxury beachfront mansion along with the official county property tax records. The records clearly displayed the legal name of the man who had supposedly died in the fatal hit-and-run accident 6 years ago. The criminal puzzle pieces were massive, undeniable, and explicitly laid out in bright, bold colors for the entire world to see. I watched the front row closely through the thick glass window of the control booth. The district attorney was no longer nodding sympathetically. He was leaning far forward, his face entirely drained of color, his sharp eyes darting rapidly across the projected banking ledgers and the Florida property records. He was a highly seasoned veteran prosecutor, and it only took him a few seconds to fully understand the monumental criminal conspiracy staring him right in the face. He stood up slowly from his chair, looking directly at Trent with an expression of absolute furious realization. He knew instantly that his entire department had been completely played for fools. The national camera crews operating the live broadcast immediately recognized the explosive nature of the moment. They swung their heavy broadcast lenses completely away from Trent and focused directly onto the massive projector screens, capturing every single damning financial document for millions of viewers watching across the country. The grand ballroom erupted into a chaotic, surging wave of shouting and aggressive whispering. Wealthy investors began physically backing away from the stage, their faces pale with sudden, terrifying panic as they realized their money was tied to a monumental federal crime. Trent was completely exposed. He stumbled backward, gripping the clear acrylic podium just to keep himself from collapsing. His perfectly tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap, poorly fitted costume. He shouted frantically into the dead microphone, demanding that someone turn the screens off immediately, but his panicked voice barely carried over the rising, deafening chaos of the angry crowd. He looked frantically toward the main entrance doors, desperately hoping for his private security team to rush in and save him. But Walter Montgomery's heavily armed private security men were already standing firmly in front of the main exits, physically blocking anyone from leaving the room. Trent realized with absolute crushing certainty that he was entirely trapped. His arrogant, confident facade completely shattered, crumbling into pure, unadulterated panic. He took a desperate step toward the heavy velvet curtains at the very back of the stage, likely intending to flee blindly through the rear service corridors and escape into the city. Before he could even reach the dark fabric, the heavy velvet curtains slowly and deliberately parted. The entire chaotic ballroom fell into a sudden, horrifying, absolute silence. The camera shutters stopped clicking entirely. Every single person in the massive room seemed to stop breathing simultaneously. The tension in the air was so incredibly thick, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the floorboards. Clara walked slowly out from the deep shadows and stepped gracefully into the blinding, bright stage lights. She was wearing the stunning, dark emerald evening gown, flowing elegantly around her fragile but resilient frame. Her long blonde hair caught the brilliant light shining beautifully against her pale, slightly hollowed features. She did not look like a broken, traumatized captive who had spent 6 years in a concrete box. She looked exactly like a powerful, vengeful queen returning from the grave to reclaim her stolen throne. Trent physically recoiled violently as if he had just been shot directly in the chest. He staggered backward wildly, tripping clumsily over the heavy metal base of the microphone stand. He crashed incredibly hard onto the polished wooden floor of the stage, his limbs flailing. He scrambled backward like a terrified, cornered animal, his eyes wide with absolute sheer horror, staring up at the literal ghost of the woman he had buried alive. He pressed his back against the base of the massive projector screens, completely paralyzed by the impossible reality standing over him. Clara did not rush toward him. She walked with immense, slow dignity until she was standing right in the absolute center of the massive stage, directly under the brightest spotlights. The district attorney in the front row gasped loudly, his hands flying to his mouth in total, absolute shock as he recognized her undeniable face. Several wealthy women in the audience began to scream in genuine terror, while others openly wept, completely unable to process the miraculous, impossible resurrection happening right in front of their eyes. Clara bent down gracefully and picked up the microphone Trent had dropped on the floorboards. Up in the control booth, I reached down to the audio board and immediately re-engaged the primary audio feed, routing it through every single speaker in the magnificent room. She looked down at the pathetic, shivering man cowering on the floor in front of her. The entire nation was watching live on television as the invincible golden boy of the commercial real estate world completely and utterly unraveled. Clara held the microphone close to her lips, and her voice echoed through the massive vaulted ceilings, loud, steady, and fiercely unbroken. She looked directly into his terrified wide eyes and told him hello, and that she was finally back. The simple, undeniable words struck the room with the kinetic force of a physical explosion. The absolute bedlam that followed was deafening. The camera crews rushed the front of the stage immediately, the flashing lights blinding the entire room as they fought to capture her face. The district attorney signaled frantically to the off-duty police officers standing near the perimeter, and they began moving aggressively, pushing through the screaming crowd toward the stage to place Trent under immediate arrest. I stood quietly in the dark control room, watching the beautiful total destruction of my brother's fraudulent criminal empire unfold perfectly. The massive screens behind Clara continued to loop the undeniable proof of his guilt, projecting his financial crimes over the chaotic historical scene below. Trent was screaming hysterically as the officers grabbed his arms, pulling him forcefully to his feet and shoving his hands behind his back. He was weeping again, but this time the tears were absolutely genuine, born of pure, terrified realization that his entire life was completely over. He had spent his entire existence building a massive fortress of lies, relying on the silence of the people he abused and discarded. He genuinely thought he could buy the truth and bury the terrifying consequences underground. He had vastly underestimated the sheer resilient power of a woman who refused to stay dead, and he had completely ignored the dangerous, quiet intellect of the invisible brother he had tried to permanently destroy. I reached down, packed up my laptop, placed the encrypted hard drive carefully into my duffel bag, and walked out of the quiet control booth. The bitter war was officially over, and we had won everything. The panic sweeping through the grand ballroom was an absolute tidal wave of human desperation. Trent snapped out of his paralyzed state the exact moment he realized the off-duty police officers were aggressively closing in on the stage. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive leather shoes slipping wildly on the polished hardwood floorboards. He abandoned the clear acrylic podium and bolted toward the heavy velvet curtains hanging behind the massive projection screens. He genuinely thought he could use the rear service corridors to escape the hotel and disappear into the dark city streets. He tore through the thick fabric, his midnight blue tuxedo ripping violently at the shoulder, but his escape path was immediately blocked. The seasoned detectives attending the gala had anticipated his exact frantic movement. 4 massive police officers grabbed Trent by the arms and slammed him face first into the solid brick wall of the rear staging area. Trent fought them like a rabid animal trapped in a snare. The sophisticated, charismatic real estate mogul the world thought they knew completely evaporated into thin air. He thrashed and kicked, screaming desperate obscenities at the officers as they forcefully wrenched his wrists behind his back and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. I walked slowly down the carpeted stairs from the upper audio-visual control booth and stepped onto the main ballroom floor, just as the police dragged my brother back out into the open space. The relentless flashing lights of the national press cameras illuminated his total and utter humiliation for the entire country to see. Trent saw me standing calmly near the edge of the stunned crowd. The sheer venom burning in his eyes was absolutely terrifying. He stopped fighting the arresting officers and lunged toward me, the heavy chains rattling sharply against his bound wrists. He screamed at the top of his lungs that I had ruined everything. He screamed that the legendary family empire was utterly destroyed, all because I was simply too jealous to accept my rightful place in the dirt. He blamed me entirely for the catastrophic collapse of our parents' massive legacy, refusing to take a single ounce of personal responsibility for the horrific crimes he had committed. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to win the war. I looked at the pathetic broken man bleeding and sweating in his torn designer tuxedo. I told him quietly that I did not ruin our family. I told him I simply turned on the bright light so everyone in the world could finally see exactly what he had built in the dark. The police dragged him away, pulling him roughly through the center of the grand ballroom as the wealthy elite he had tried so desperately to impress watched his monumental downfall in absolute stunned silence. The epic conclusion of my brother's golden life was written entirely in federal indictments and aggressive asset seizure notices. The timeline of our story jumps forward a few grueling months, revealing the absolute total dismantling of his fragile, corrupt universe. The very morning after the chaotic charity gala, the Federal Bureau of Investigation launched a massive coordinated raid on every single corporate office connected to Trent's vast real estate portfolio. Federal agents seized countless filing cabinets, heavily encrypted digital servers, and thousands of offshore bank routing numbers. The sheer volume of forensic evidence I had downloaded from my old accounting firm's server made the prosecution incredibly swift and brutally devastating. The district attorney formally charged Trent with a staggering list of federal felonies. He faced multiple consecutive life sentences for aggravated kidnapping, domestic terrorism, wire fraud, bank fraud, and severe witness tampering. The man residing in Florida, who had accepted the massive bribes to fake his own violent death in the fabricated hit-and-run accident, flipped on my brother immediately. He testified against Trent in exchange for a highly reduced prison sentence, providing the ruthless federal prosecutors with recorded phone calls and original banking receipts that tied Trent directly to the conspiracy. The mountain of undeniable proof was so overwhelmingly massive that Trent's high-priced defense attorneys eventually advised him to completely surrender and plead guilty to every single charge. Trent is currently sitting in a cold, concrete cell inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, awaiting a final sentencing hearing that will undoubtedly keep him locked behind thick iron bars for the rest of his natural life. The poetic justice of his permanent situation was absolute. The cruel man who had buried his innocent wife in a windowless concrete box under a toxic swamp was now permanently assigned to live in one himself. But the legal destruction did not stop with simple criminal charges. The Internal Revenue Service audited his entire fraudulent history and immediately moved to seize his commercial properties. Because Trent had foolishly used his existing real estate as leverage for predatory loans, the entire $40 million empire completely collapsed overnight. The massive glass skyscrapers, the luxury shopping centers, and the high-rise apartment buildings were all liquidated in a highly publicized federal bankruptcy court. Even the remaining financial assets from our parents' original estate were entirely stripped away by the government. The federal courts officially ruled that our parents were active, willing co-conspirators in the brutal kidnapping and the fraudulent cover-up. Every single dollar they had left behind was aggressively seized and redirected to pay massive criminal restitution and federal penalties. The glorious, untouchable legacy my family had sacrificed their actual souls to protect was completely wiped off the face of the earth. Their famous name was unceremoniously ripped off the sides of downtown buildings. They had traded their basic humanity for an empire of dirt, and in the end the wind had simply blown it all away into nothingness. While Trent's corrupt world dissolved into ash, Clara began the slow, beautiful process of reclaiming her stolen life. The physical and emotional recovery was certainly not easy. She spent weeks working intensively with specialized trauma therapists, learning exactly how to navigate the overwhelming noise and the bright flashing lights of a modern society she had been violently hidden from for 6 brutal years. But Clara possessed an incredibly resilient spirit. She was no longer the fragile, terrified captive I had found shivering on a leather sofa beneath the mud. She was a fierce survivor who had walked through the absolute darkest fires imaginable and emerged completely forged in unbreakable steel. Walter Montgomery, the fierce bulldog trust attorney, utilized his vast legal authority to aggressively dismantle the fraudulent probate ruling. He filed emergency petitions in the state Supreme Court, completely nullifying the fabricated death certificate and legally resurrecting Clara in the eyes of the federal government. Within 2 short months, her entire $50 million blind trust fund was fully restored to her rightful secure ownership. The major corporate banks that had illegally accepted her stolen money to cover Trent's bad loans were forced to return every single penny under the immediate threat of massive federal lawsuits. Clara did not simply take her immense fortune and hide from the world. She decided to build a completely new legacy, untainted by the toxic greed of the past. She launched her own legitimate independent investment firm designed specifically to fund sustainable infrastructure projects and vital community development programs across the Midwest. She wanted to use her massive resources to build things that actually helped working-class people instead of funding empty corporate monuments to human ego. On the exact day she officially signed the legal incorporation papers for her new company, she invited me to join her in a private meeting room overlooking the Chicago River. She handed me a thick leather-bound folder containing a highly lucrative formal employment contract. Clara looked at me with deep, profound gratitude shining in her eyes. She told me that I was the only person in her entire life who had ever looked at a hopeless, condemned situation and decided to fiercely dig for the truth anyway. She said she desperately needed a man of absolute, unshakable integrity to manage her financial resources. She officially appointed me as the chief financial officer of her new investment firm, handing me full executive control over the entire $50 million portfolio. The quiet, invisible forensic accountant, who had been mocked, fired, and violently evicted by his own family, was now sitting at the very top of a massive, legitimate financial institution. I had finally found a place where my meticulous nature and my strict demand for the absolute truth were actually deeply valued. I am standing right now in the executive suite of my new corner office, looking out through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The sprawling, beautiful city of Chicago stretches out for miles beneath me. The sun is currently setting, casting a brilliant golden light across the steel skyscrapers and the busy, packed highways. It is the exact same view I had on the day my parents' will was read in the cold attorney's office, but the man looking at the city today has completely, fundamentally changed. Sometimes I reach into the top drawer of my polished mahogany desk and pull out the heavy, rusted iron key. I keep it there as a permanent daily reminder of the defining turning point of my entire existence. My parents and my brother truly believed that absolute power was found in superficial wealth, in custom designer suits, in loud public speeches, and in the ruthless, brutal domination of other people. They gave Trent a massive golden empire, genuinely thinking it would secure his grand place in the world forever. They gave me a rusted piece of scrap metal and a condemned, toxic swamp, fully thinking it would bury me entirely. They completely misunderstood the fundamental nature of building a lasting legacy. Trent completely destroyed his golden empire because his personal foundation was made of pure greed, deep corruption, and absolute moral bankruptcy. A towering house built on malicious lies will inevitably collapse the very moment a severe storm hits the coast. But the rusted key they handed to me unlocked the most profound, ultimate truth of my life. It forced me to stop accepting the toxic, passive narrative my family had assigned to me since childhood. It pushed me into the dark, terrifying unknown where I somehow managed to save an innocent life and completely dismantle a highly dangerous criminal dynasty. I used the exact tool they meant for my ultimate humiliation to build an unbreakable, authentic legacy. True lasting power is not simply handed to you in a pristine manila envelope at a fancy mahogany table. It is forged in the grueling moments when you are violently stripped of everything you love, pushed to the absolute terrifying edge of survival, and forced to definitively decide exactly what kind of human being you are going to be. If you are listening to this story right now and you currently feel like the world has pushed you permanently into the dark shadows, do not ever accept their cruel definition of your worth. Selfish, arrogant people will always try to hand you their broken cast-off pieces, hoping you will just quietly disappear into the background. But sometimes, the very thing they give you to guarantee your failure is the exact key you need to unlock your ultimate victory. You just have to be strong enough and brave enough to turn the heavy lock and face whatever is waiting for you in the dark. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. If this story resonated with you and reminded you of your own hidden inner strength, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who might be fighting a really difficult battle in the shadows right now. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when you took a highly difficult, unfair situation and somehow turned it into your greatest triumph. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story about hard truth, fierce resilience, and the incredible unyielding power of the human spirit.